Hello everyone, today we talk about early Germanic warfare. This is just an introduction. I think we never addressed Germanic warfare per se, right? We talked a lot about especially the Roman-German relations in the ancient as well as actually in medieval times, as you know, this thing fundamentally is at the base of much what eventually the West has become as a hybrid, the fundamentals of which are very actual still today. And we can say that Western civilization, Western historiography, and even identity highly revolve around this connubium, if you want, that naturally derives from a clash and a meeting, right? And a composition, if you want, altogether that was very fruitful eventually for the history of the continent. The question here is to address a time in history that today we look from a historical point of view, because that's the point essentially of the video and the channel that is broadly speaking about warfare. That is the beginning of this encounter, and therefore also we have to make a great effort to understand what is the evidence, the base that over which we can build a historical understanding and judgment about these realities. So as you understand, it's an enormous topic, and that's why this is just a beginning. Today I go without any form of sketch, so it will be probably long, and I need you to follow me in the process. So first and foremost, one most evident macroscopic factor. We know about the Germans, the so-called Germans in Germanic warfare, essentially through Roman sources. Archaeology is dramatically important in this, as for most of ancient history and beyond for many contexts, but objectively our understanding of these societies passes chiefly and overwhelmingly through what, and exclusively I would say actually, through what the Romans wrote. The Romans had a very complex and important relation with the Germans, whom they found extremely fascinating, and even in here we have to understand why and who wrote specifically about this, and to confront, I presume as Westerners, with the fact that we are obviously basing ourselves on, biased sources, as any source could possibly be, the documentary one at that time, and especially with a very high level one. Right, here we're talking about the greatest civilization that the world had ever seen up to that point, that is properly becomes such in the moment to which it meets the Germans, and it's expressed in fact by some of the greatest authors and pieces of literature in this regard of the ancient world. We're talking mostly about Caesar, about Tacitus, especially with Caesar, naturally also says dramatically and important things. You cannot understand anything about that world if you do not pass through these sources, which means that, first of all, you should know Latin at least. Secondly, that you should know a bit what the context here was. And especially regarding Tacitus, understanding what was the point of these sources. Right? If we don't start from this, there is no way we can have an intelligent take on the matter. Intelligent from the etymological side of the story. Tacitus was writing from a perspective, naturally, of a Roman senator in times that had conventionally gone past. Not the relation between Romans and Germans was still there, but very important settlements that include, as you know, the Roman conquest and the Roman loss of Germany, of this territory that, even in here, I will not debate again the ethnographical concept of Germany. Here we're naturally talking about an exclusively Roman evidence of idea of Germany that obviously has absolutely nothing to do, not even with properly the national concept of it, because the national, the term national today, nation, is something very different from the Roman equivalent of natio, right? And we're talking about a set of peoples that surely had more than something in common, but that first of all are very difficult to distinguish from a variety of others, including the Celts, including the surrounding, look at Dacia, look at the Scythians, and so on, that the Romans identify in this way for reasons that remain largely difficult to understand, and that we can address only looking at fundamentally how the same Romans stereotyped these populations. The Germanic identity is not a matter of debate today. I mean, historiographically speaking, I don't think there is no academy in the world that even thinks to pretend that there was a common Germanic identity. There were mostly chunks, perhaps at best, of the same Germans. They also partly correspond to certain linguistical branches, as a matter of fact. I suspect that there was actually an understanding of these peoples at some point, of who they were for the Romans as a whole, right? And therefore this contributed in turn to the definition of their own broader identity. But what they were mostly concerned about, and also because they were fundamentally all at war with each other most of the times, it was their tribal background, right? What is properly the Latin term of natio, right? And the differences were not dramatic, but they weren't even with the other peoples that surrounded them. So, for example, in this period, to distinguish a Celt from a German is really a challenge, right? Just the Romans did it for us, right? And even in an ambiguous way that, for example, doesn't quite even correspond, as for many other things such as religion, the deities, right? The Romans tended to, naturally, as any people, these are things that are studied widely, also not just in the historical field, but anthropologically speaking, of what, the conception of the other is on the base of your own system of reference in a way, right? The Romans also had a very complex idea of themselves and of others, right? They were, for example, very different from the Greeks that lived in their own bubble, and they considered the rest of the world as fundamentally as inferior in some form, properly cultural terms. The Romans were nothing like that. The same concept of barbarity that today is coming on the fore, just because even in here, I presume that the difference between the concept of barbarian for a Roman or for a Greek should be known to any Western person who went to primary school, but unfortunately it's not the case, and this is very sad, by the way. But the Romans had actually they surely didn't have much of a positive idea of these populations. The Romans could be as arrogant, and actually the Romans felt they were legitimately, especially at that point, because they had achieved it, the chosen people destined to rule the world, right? The Romans, not very differently actually from the Germans at certain levels at least, but it took many centuries for that to happen, and even there at some point was also diluted in the High Middle Ages into the Romanity, the abandonment of the concept of Germanic by a certain standard for what the imperial authority was concerned. But the Romans had never thought, even for an instant, that at some point they would have not conquered the world, right? This is not a concept that you can easily transpose to any modern standard, because for us the world is the one you see in school, in the globe, and the map. That's your idea. It's a highly cold, sterile, aseptical, brutally secularized idea of the world. The idea of the world in the ancient world it's something fundamentally religious and military. I will not explain it again for the sake of, but it's deeply connected to the idea that fundamentally earthly glory is not human, but connected to the celestial divinity. That is the one that confers, in fact, as for the Romans called it, the imperium, so this faculty to rule the world. And this was the obsession of every single polity that existed at the time, from the greatest universal empires to these very tribes, right? And don't think that there was in fact much of a different standard in this sense in the warlike ethos of a German, the one of a Roman. They were just declined in different ways on the basis of the fact that naturally these were importantly different societies. So naturally we go by these macroscopical separations and things like these were Celts, these were Germans, these were Scythians, and so on. But we have to recognize at that point that this is a concept that served the Romans to tell a narrative, and that the sources that explain this are a few, right? Are really a few. We are talking about the ancient world. This is very, very primitive times at so many levels. They, if you read ancient sources, sometimes you're really struck by the modernity of certain minds. The Greeks, especially, I don't know if you read Polybius about the rise of the Roman Republic, the Romans were, in a way, still different and had a slightly lower capacity of abstraction for which everything fundamentally related to them. And the Germans, what they had made of them, were extremely functional to tell a story that is paradoxically what, in fact, large part of nationalistic ideas today are fed by. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. Just think about the Valhalla of the Germans built in the 19th century. There is nothing but a purely classical temple, right? It could be easily an Hellenic or a Roman one, right? So here you understand that if you want to address the mentality of those times, you at least have to accept that, first of all, we can't. Secondly, that if we really can't do something positive about it, is coming closer to the broader coordinates that these sources tell us. And finally, to accept that the categories that we reason through are largely and unavoidably the ones of these very sources. Right? That is, we do not have the voice of the Germans, which is something important, and also burdensome, because fundamentally we brought over us the vision of the Roman Empire that is something that naturally also entailed certain moral standards that are very different from our own. And of course also the Germanic ones were at the same level, if not more in a way. I mean, Rome, after all, is closer to us than a tribal reality. But, for example, the easy stereotype of the so-called noble barbarian, or the good savage, right? This is something that exists in history. Think about colonialism. Think about, I don't know, the ennobling for ideological, historiographical reasons of the older enemy, right? Just think about, I don't know, the English with the Celts or the Spanish with the Moors. I mean, the idea at a certain point that they had to exalt the fact that your enemies define essentially who you are, so the better your enemies are, and the better you are, in a sense, right? And the history of the Germanic peoples in this time is naturally the history of also a resistance, at least in as much as the conquest and freeing of Germany with the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest is concerned, is one of the single most, first of all, history-changing events ever happened, right? The romanization of Germany was probably more feasible than what we expected, or at least it would be in a measure that would have radically changed the history of mankind. And that is described by mostly senators that were, first of all, against the older system, mostly the Julio-Claudian dynasty. I mean, we mostly get these things from Flavian times. And secondly, we get it specifically from a senatorial perspective. That was the one that, as the most conservative and traditionalist element of society, differently from the emperors and the people and the army, right? And always remember this, that as far as that vision is concerned, we know dramatically few. Most of what we know here is senatorial, which is literally another world. I mean, you know that senators literally govern certain provinces on their own. The other ones, the most militarized one, incidentally, were actually ruled directly by the emperor, and as a consequence, the senatorial standpoint was the one, naturally, of those who did not want to conquer other peoples, right? Because they fundamentally didn't have interest to integrate other oligarchies within the Roman political system, which is instead what the emperors, what the middle classes have always had an enormous interest to do. It's basically the only reason why the Roman Empire also exists, because no other empire in history, at least if not by Roman legacy, has done anything like properly the concept of extending a citizenship, which is something very different from, the freeing of a slave, or of another, tribal equation of what can be the absorption of other elements. So it still, of course, existed all over the world in other ways. But it's something very different that entails specific political and social duties that are still at the base of Western civilization, at the very root of it, among a few others, technically. So the idea in here is that mostly also Tacitus depicted the Germans as these noble, good savages, if you want, that resisted the corrupt and perverse Roman oppressor. I mean, literally, the ethno-nationalistic propaganda that fed itself of the idea, these terrible Romans, like the dark, ugly, short Mediterraneans wanted to conquer this noble, pure, free, white people, is literally a Roman invention. Right, this is kind of, obviously insultive for the mental deficiency of ethno-nationalist people, but it's properly their reasoning exactly in the way, they're getting fed exactly by what the Romans told them to think about the thing, which is a stereotype that started really from afar, right, from those very times, and still has an immense success today, immense, so much that I plan to make more than one video about this topic, because I confess it to you, this is probably one of the single most important unresolved issues that can really save Western civilization, that I presume today is, not that it will be disrupted in a terrible way, but it will be fundamentally diluting itself into itself, to tell the truth, because the reason why Westerners today fundamentally haven't the slightest idea of what it means to be a Westerner, mostly because they have absolutely no idea of their own history, and they never had it, telling the truth. I mean, they were pushed at some point to be Westerners by other dynamics. Today, those dynamics are over, and if you do not know your history, which largely, there is no single people in the world that knows its own history on average, just specialists legitimately do, and that's why also we should call for a radical reform in our educational systems that takes this into consideration. I presume we have really to be very careful about this, and we have to especially focus pretty well what it means to talk about civilization, and how can we really learn from, in terms of conscience, of responsibility, of civic duty, what it's about, right? It's obvious that at 2,000 years of distance, we have an enormous problem, because this thing from those times on went on, right? It was resumed at different times. The Holy Roman Empire, for example, its creation still brought on the fore once again. Its relation also with the Byzantine Empire, the concept of Germanity, the concept of Romanity. We made important videos. That's as far as the Middle Ages are concerned. Then Reformation and Counter-Reformation are also probably one of the single most impacting, culturally speaking, dynamics that still define the perception of a chunk of Europe and of the West, broadly speaking, and another chunk of Europe and the West, and much of even today's political debate within the European Union, believe me, it's based on those perceptions. They are mostly mass perceptions. I mean, the elites objectively know how to manipulate the masses about it from one side or the other, but the masses should be the backbone, right, of the moral objectivity, if civilization can stem ever from the people, right? And that's what we're losing. That's what we're seriously losing, and that's why it's important to talk about these things. There is another consideration that is quite interesting. Think about the tribal ethnonyms that fundamentally that were washed away, even in a very few time, historically speaking. Think about the Saint Cherusci that led the coalition against Rome in the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, that rose to preeminence and eventually were taken down. Arminius himself assassinated by the same Germans because he wanted fundamentally to extend its rule on this reality, and the Germans, as we'll see in a while, were fundamentally very much against any form of monarchy, at least in the sense that, in the more modern sense, of course, even Latin sources speak of rex. The equivalent Celtic rex is also meaningful. I think about, I don't know, Boiorix of the Cimbrian Wars, for example. That's another interesting and fascinating chapter, very overlooked one. One which, for example, with the Battle of Arausio, the Romans suffered the single most bloody defeat in their history. Right? Most people today know about Cannae, they know about Teutoburg Forest, they know about Adrianople. It's not that these were not important defeats, but hell, do you realize that the greatest bath of Roman blood would happen at Arausio, at the hands of these northern populations that we don't understand clearly. They were a mix of Germans and Celts, to tell it all, but even in here, what are the Germans, what are the Celts? Let's say broader Northern European peoples that, by the way, had toured around, had devastated Noricum, Italy, Spain, Gaul, right? So even in here to say that there was no common feeling at all, of course, in an anti-Roman fashion, and that all these peoples were fundamentally just thinking on their own, and very much not even on their own, as far as they were dramatically fragmented from a political point of view, and constantly just living by oppressing each other on a regular base. So in order to introduce Germanic warfare, we have to enter in this mindset that I presume the single most important thing. We're talking about people who essentially sacrificed young people in their free time by strangling them and throwing them into the swamps. Right? People who lived badly on subsistence agriculture. They were governed from what is known by literal criminals. I mean, English historiography uses the term war band, that is literally mobsters, and that's not as the mob. That's exactly, by definition, what the mob is. Who engage into the industrial slave trade, right? As all the mostly enslaved people in history have done. I mean, the first responsible of their enslaving were themselves, because these people fought constantly and constantly exported their own, prisoners in a way of war that naturally lost their freedom in a way that here is way more brutal than you imagine, because it's connected exactly to the idea of that military religious ideal, for which it's not that here the identity counts anything. If I conquer you, you are nothing, right? Here we're talking about a world that has. That's why it's important to erase any kind of nationalistic mindset here, because here the only discriminant was if you were capable of killing another person. If you were worthy of it. These were their moral standards, right? The strongest has the right to rule. The other does not exist, which means, as it was true in German society, as it was true in Roman society, or in any other society at the time, if you are my slave, I can kill you for no reason, just for fun, whenever I want. And we know they did that on a regular base, right? This is not, sometimes you find these things, the German slaves were treated better than those in the Italian farmlands. Aside from the fact that we even have archaeological evidence of unspeakable things that happened in those wars. But do you think that, these were worlds where, there was kind of a modern concept of welfare, of wellness, of stability, right? Of something that you can minimally relate to in our own times, right? The Germans had a large servile class that was certainly not treated well, right? We have testimonies, as we're saying, in this sense, that contrast not a little with the ideal description that Tacitus gave themselves, and that's the easy stereotype we were talking about before, because we're fed by the Roman things here, guys. That's the problem. And I love to tell it all to me as a Westerner. I pretty much know, and I don't want to make it an identitary fashion of even a presumption saying, those were my ancestors. But I truly love, for many reasons, many personal reasons, both the Germans and the Romans. In a way, I will never be able to fully express, right? What I do on Schwerpunkt is a very unworthy tribute to the memory of these peoples, but the memory of these peoples does not entail the fact that we have to express a moralistic... we can express a moral judgment. I actually have no problem with that, and that's exactly what I'm doing, actually. But there is no point of having a moralistic attitude towards them, because it doesn't make any sense. This is a context that was utterly disgusting by any standard. Let's be honest about it. The Roman world was horrible. The German world was horrible, but still, the entire world was, and either we accept this immediately, right? The sooner the better, right? We have to accept it. There is not a true, in terms of today's moral standard, there is no pride that we can derive from the reality of this world, and there is no need for any reason to take it in this sense. The pride that we can take is only by isolating those elements of true civilization that surely were present in a more evident sense in Rome or in other similar cultures with a similar level of development, but also among the Germans, because civilization is a process that takes form over time. It's universal. It belongs to all peoples, right? It's just that some arrive earlier for certain reasons. There are not even just good ones, right? And others later, and reflect on the fact that we are the consequence of those achievements, those tiny achievements. It went tiny bit by tiny bit, right? Step after step to arrive to the standpoint where we are now. And if we were projected in those realities, this is what we should reflect on. We would do exactly the same, because the way these peoples were not for culturalist reasons, right? There is nothing intrinsically good or evil in either Roman or German culture. There is not in any culture. There is just an explanation of what happens and what single humans do, and for which reason that we have to explain scientifically. We have to explain historically, anthropologically, biologically, in many ways that we can all appreciate. These peoples had art, had their own literature, if you want. The Germans were largely illiterate, but they had this. Think about the barritos, and all the chants of these songs that eventually, were passed down, transformed over generations, and eventually come to us through the German epics, even through the sagas. There was something to this that objectively you cannot but fall in love with, but without any other need of saying, I was that person. No, that's not it, right? We have, as a broader culture, broader civilization, important, in their, in relative terms, modest part, the accomplishments of these people. But it's the work of few. It's the work of an improvement that, yes, we also share partly, but that we largely get from our past through the ages. And it's very difficult to distrocate ourselves through this by going straight to the point. Those are my ancestors, therefore I have to feel like I am those people. No, because you will never be like these people. And I will tell you more, that whoever you are, and whichever people you're choosing 2,000 years ago, if they had known who you were, they would have spit in your face, to say the least. Because by their moral standards, you're nothing but a disgusting slob, a coward, an inferior being. And that's what they truly believed. So that's, I presume, the best way to picture the fact that there is no need to take that approach, right? We have also this dramatic clash, not just with the Romans in Germanic history, because as you know, the Romans intervened formally in Gaul. It's under Caesar, even before, actually, because the Cimbrian Wars had created enormous problems also to Gaul back in the day. At the end of the 2nd century BC, most Gauls, at least some of the most important, the Aedui mostly, were Roman allies. So the migration of these peoples across Europe and the ensuing devastations and destruction and so on were quite of a big deal, that properly also opened, given the ease through which the Germans, for example, poured into Gaul, unstopped, right, until they basically were confronted with the Romans. And even in there, as we've seen, they were able to inflict them literally the bloodiest defeat in their history, but eventually they were substantially wiped out. Just a few of them came back to where they had come from originally alive. And the concept is, even in here, we're talking about in the broader dealing, even with later with Ariovistus, that is the Suebic leader. The Caesar calls him Rex, but even in here, what it means is vague. It was just one of the chieftains of these broader Suebic confederacy that, as you know, was actually in the northeast of Germany. Was this greater system of, in fact, and this is exactly what I want to get to. So a mixture of agreements between criminal gangs, right? And believe me, this is not because of the Germans. This is what the entire tribal history of mankind has always been, right? If you take individually these peoples and you confrontate with, I don't know, the ones of Siberia or North America, they were exactly, in different stage of developments. We know that that's exactly the same thing. Right, the same anthropological. Even think about the wolf warriors, the bear warriors. Those are things that existed all over the world. The same Romans actually had that. The same concept of migrating, of the comitatus, going out there. It's always been at the base of universal tribal demographics, manpower. It's always been there in its seasonalism, in its so we're talking of largely, truly homogeneous realities by a certain standard. And that's important to explain why we make the point that even it's difficult to distinguish these peoples from others, because objectively there is no separation in a national sense as we can address. We understand that in a certain area it was a concentration of something that other peoples believed it was something different. But even just if you look at material cultural archaeology, for example, what did the Germans really create on their own? Most of their equipment was firstly Celtic or Roman derived over time, right? So that some of you even said, the word Celts, because the proof, among the Cimbrian migrations, because there were Celt artifacts. Well, thanks to my eyes, what do you think the Germans fundamentally use? Do you think we can substantially differentiate a German warrior from a Celtic warrior in this broader Central European area? It's very difficult, right? Over time, there is the superimposition also of other influences. The Scythian influence, I presume, from the east is deeply overlooked at certain levels. Also because the Germans, fundamentally, they're stamped by the Romans. They're kicked out of Gaul within the Rhine and Danube borders, and mostly expand towards the east. Right, and about that history, for example, we do not know almost anything, right? It's not even archaeology can tell us, archaeological finds do not have tags that tells you, this is like German or this is Sarmatian. It's all right. There are broader spheres of cultural influence, of material culture. It's all blended in, and even Celtic metallurgy, for example, was pretty well advanced for the time. It seemingly actually derived, as most actually of metallurgy in those times, in later times, because during the migration era there was a further injection from the steppes cultures, right? This is pretty well known, so it's the way we teach history and we make history is today, relatively especially at these times, is considering boundaries as something extremely extended and mostly overlapping, right? So what remains to us, literally as we were saying before, is the documentary evidence that tells objectively something more intelligent, because it's designed to be so. Archaeology is not found to be found, right? Not even a tomb is made to be found specifically, but it had its own specific meaning and value for those cultures and societies and so on. So we have to make it, naturally, Germanistic has something, one of the most ancient, philologically correct disciplines. I mean, we're talking about accomplishments that started just from the late modern age, right, from an historiographical point of view. But it's one of those topics that, if anybody knows, even just basically, is fully aware since an enormous amount of time about these very issues. So any other opinion regarding it's not very wise to be stressed, to say the least. Just look it up. The point I hear about here is realizing that the Romans, in the process, started defining this criminal gangs, because the concept of comitatus, and now we'll explain it, was essentially that, as peoples that were atrociously suppressed by the Romans, as the Romans could definitely well do, in these devastating campaigns associated with terroristic massacres, right? Think about what Caesar did after he defeated Ariovistus. I mean, he crosses the Rhine. By the way, displaying this dramatic military engineering capabilities, building twice bridge on the Rhine, something that Germans had never even ever conceived of, and carrying out one of the single bloodiest massacres in the history of those centuries, to literally deter, and that functioned pretty damn well. The same thing was done partially also in Britain for the same reason. Caesar didn't have any intention to settle in those lands because he didn't have the resources, but he just wanted to make the Germans and the Britons staying out of Gaul because of their interference, and that worked pretty well, right? That's usually what you achieve. And also eventually, when, as far as the conquest of Germany was concerned, also to put the rioters down, right? The Romans did care about the conquest of Germany, and that's also an obscure chapter of historiography, because tendentially speaking, we have the idea of Drusus and Tiberius being a certain kind, Germanicus of another, but objectively, even the figure of Varus that is accused of having, produced the revolt in Germany for having treated the Germans as slaves, seemingly had done exactly the other way around. Like, while Drusus and Tiberius, that were some of the greatest generals in Roman history, had brutally, in the most brutal way, we're talking about, the conquest of Germany might have taken down something like 150,000 people. Those are the numbers, guys. That's the scale of the Roman activity. And it was done exactly to put these peoples down. Varus loosened the grip, right? So the idea he started vexating the Germans is something, after a massacre of 150,000 people, really, it wasn't that that triggered the revolt. Today we're not going to discuss eventually the causes of this, because we will have to do specific videos on the issue, but that's just for making you understand what we're talking about in terms of sheer political and moral dimension. Here we're witnessing the clash between the most efficient and disruptive machine of conquest and plunder that has ever existed, with a possible exception of the Mongols, and a group of slaver criminals who dominated an underdeveloped and brutal territory. If we do not agree on this, unsubscribe from Schwerpunkt, get away, because here there is no room for you, but not because of this topic, but because of the entire history of mankind. This is the reality of that world. If you cannot accept this, that our civilization derives largely from this imperialistic, disruptive, ruthless, military machine, exterminating machine, and also from essentially these bands of mobsters that dominated over this dramatically primitive reality, as especially the German one was in Augustan times, because things evolved over time. There cannot be any agreement on any political, social, military, moral standard that we can discuss on this channel as a whole. This is the historical reality as far as the most updated historiography has by far very well ascertained. This is nobody's opinions anymore, because any person who has at least addressed the sources knows that we know them from literally 2,000 years, because they are literally the same sources that have existed since 2 millennia. So there is no, there is no way you can come up with a new idea with that, right? And this is the standpoint, the only standpoint we can start discussing what this reality was. The early Germanic warfare is understandable exclusively also for military reasons that are, in terms of military comparison with other peoples, if you accept the inane and unthinkable brutality and violence that you can imagine, which a person from the 21st century absolutely cannot understand, right? Because maybe a person from the 21st century, even today, as fortunately we haven't personally, I think most of us lived there, but you see, this is different from the Holocaust. This is not like an industrialized system in which you have a population, for example, that is kept unaware of the physical destruction of 10 millions of people, and that goes on with a certain level of culture, of advancement and so on, just under this vicious totalitarian ideology. Here we're talking about a world that exposed you psychophysically to certain experiences that to call traumatic today would be reductive, right? We have not anymore the mental and physical let's say not capacity, because we are biologically literally the same human beings. We haven't changed by a comma in 2,000 years. That's why I told you that if we were projected there, we would do exactly the same things. But we have completely lost any track, fortunately, of the context of what this reality was. I discussed the brutality of tribal warfare in the Iron Age, often as far as the Celtic warfare was concerned. I presumed I gave a good explanation, especially in the video about Gaelic warfare, ancient Gaelic warfare. Also made videos on Celtic warfare that tell you substantially about what these war bands were, right? And if I were to tell you how did the Germans differ from that reality, I would commit a mistake, because objectively they didn't, right? There are just minor differences that today we try to address to give a bit of more of a color, just touch, a pinch of of characterization. But we're talking about the same identical worlds, right? Especially at this time where there were realities that were quite similar also to the Germans one, especially if you look at German ones. If you look at other especially towards the east of Europe, right? There are certain populations that between Central Europe and the Balkans resembled greatly, and for reasons now we'll try also to address the level of political cohesion in function of military activity that we can identify for Germany, including part of Celtic realities that are mostly also concentrated on the Danube, that is also, in fact, in this sense, a bit continuous with the Germanic world. Just think about the Marcomanni that at this time, stemming essentially from that Swabian confederacy we're talking about, descended towards the lands of the Boy in today's Bohemia, as a matter of fact, and created this kind of Celto-German reality, also with interesting levels of advancements, because, I don't know, metallurgy, for example, was more advanced there, surely, than in north of Europe, also close to Noricum. That was the, in terms of, at least of, well, as far as continental Europe was concerned, was maybe just with Spain, actually, the most advanced metallurgical center of Europe. So even in there, it's difficult for us to be concrete. We are talking about naturally a time now between essentially the end of 2nd century BC to where do you want to go? Like up to the Marcomannic Wars, like so up to the second half of the 2nd century AD, just for meaning what we're talking about for the early Germans, because objectively the Germans, and we've seen it often in the videos in the migration era, underwent this dramatic changes over time, as far as, especially as their warfare was concerned. But that's a reflection of their political and social reality. But in these times, in these early times, there were also something specific and very far, even by certain standards, that are really small in that time's perspective, but still significant for a pre-industrial society from, I don't know, the most advanced Celtic world, right? It was just next door. But that were dramatically cohesive, right? This is the only difference that you can properly attribute to the Germans in the substantial reason of their strength, of their capacities. This is something that we have seen also among the Celts. I mean, the fact that the Belgians or the Helvetii, that were fundamentally also neighboring the Germans and partly also mixed with them, were, in terms of the rest of the Celtic average, right? Why were they stronger? Because they had different tactics compared to the other Celts? Hell, no. Celtic material culture was dramatically homogeneous all over, right? Foreign influences didn't extend but a few tens of miles in the hinterland, right? You cannot say that a Celt that lived closer to Rome or to south, the Hellenic colonies of southern Gaul was fighting in a different way. Those people that believe that they were imitating the Roman found. No, these people we know that politically and socially were grammatically all similar. What really made that they fought in the same identical way? What remain are certain shades, like, I don't know, the survival of chariot warfare in some of the, in fact, most primitive areas of in fact, less developed area, and also less militarily advanced areas of the Celtic world, like it was North Africa, for example, but that also remained. And that goes in parallel with the difference that existed with the peoples like the Romans and so on. Gaul was conquered in 8 years. Conquest of Britain also was dramatically easy. The same conquest of Germany actually was easy, right? The Romans invested a lot of resources, mostly from an infrastructural point of view. They created a dramatic set of fortresses and bridges, roads, etc., military camps all over the Rhine River before launching the conquest of Germany up to the Elbe. And they went on, right, as it was done at the time, essentially a series of repeated campaigns to submit that people exterminate that other, compromising with that other, and wiping out, as we've seen, a pretty substantial amount of population. The Germans in these centuries were, if you picture the thing, we were fundamentally descending from Northern Europe, right? Where they probably had also mixed with certain Indo-European populations, were also, they conferred them certain physical characteristics. They boomed in a similar way, even to Scandinavia did. I don't know what we think it did in Viking times. They began to pour into the continent. There is pretty good evidence of these movements that weren't necessarily conflictual, right? We know the Scandinavian society, paradoxically, was actually more peaceful than the continental one, because they were also, they were less stratified realities. They fought with less intensity in a way. I mean, from an individual point of view, they might have been actually rougher in a sense, but the concept of the Zip and the Comitatus is something that was deeply felt in the moment in which these peoples crossed the sea, mostly the Baltic, or through the Danish island, the Danish straits, and whatever. But from those channels and entering a territory was pretty damn crowded, right? Similar things went on, I don't know, in the British Islands, for example, when the Belgians had this, numerous waves of migrations at the point that were certain Celts that had arrived there, I don't know, in 500 BC, that, meeting those that arrived in 200 BC said, what the hell are these guys, right? And, as they had also changed and dramatically, also regarding the Celts, for example, there is almost no evidence of sort, I think, except for one single deity in the Gaelic context that might be connected, for example, to deities that existed in Gaul, right? These were importantly, from an identity point of view, they were importantly different realities, right? They were similar, homogeneous, but what was important for them in the simplicity of that pre-industrial world, tribal reality, was exactly the tribe. That's what they cared about. That's what they felt they were fighting for and doing for. There were broader realizations of things like, of Britain possibly as a wall, or even of Gaul intended in, at least in the tripartition that probably Caesar himself recognized. I mean, the fact that even these names like German, what does German mean specifically? These were the Germanen, right? So the concept of the man with a spear, that is the universal picture of a freeman, of a warrior, right? It's not an identity, a coloredly national character. It's what, in the mindset of these people, was the prototype of a man in the universe, and that's how they saw it like. So much they were unaware, not of the non-existence of the existence of other peoples, which they began to know. Like, contacts between Germany and Italy are so evident at many levels since the Bronze Age. It's so clear. Even just the runes seemingly had possibly an Etruscan connection, and there is really nothing strange with that. The same goes for Gaul, right? But this world is awakening from a reality that I don't know how to explain how this could be, but probably they thought something like, there had been an age of gods, and now that they were an age of heroes, and then eventually it would transition into an age of men. There was a secularization, a rationalization of thought, right? Their moral and religious systems were very simple, right? Especially the least, the simpler the societies were, the lighter was, and the more was the strictly contractual and non-ideological concept of even just of religion. I mean, I'm talking about religion that informed the whole culture of these peoples, because that it was one thing with the world. The world is, as we already said, especially for these peoples, exclusively religious and military. There is nothing else in the horizons of these peoples. There was not. There was not even in the mindset of the Romans up to, very late in time. And we could go on relatively to this broader contextualization, but that's essentially what you have to enter in mind, that if you were born a man, you were fundamentally a warrior that had to fight. And naturally, by this time, the early Germans were mostly peasantry, right? We realized that there were naturally elites that weren't dramatically advanced over the rest of the people. There is this very interesting balance that, for example, is being lost mostly also in the Gallic world. Is pretty damn more stratified, of a functional bulk of middle-class freemen that also check the rise of the excessive rise, at least, of our resources, right? Germans famously elected their chieftains, a bit like old warlike peoples, ideally, from the assembly of the freemen, and only for wartime, as far as peacetime was concerned, everything came back, ideally, the way it was. But this is exactly what confers them, in part, the cohesion necessary to stand as so actively dynamic and uncompromising populations. Naturally, it's naive to think that Rome didn't have the means to reconquer Germany, to settle there. There was a specific intention to give up Germany up to some other times. The Romans tried actually to invade it in great style other 2 times. Once it was aborted with the death of Marcus Aurelius. Another time it actually took place under Maximinian the Trajan, but also that was short-lived for the internal what was the end of the emperor, so Germany is still today this mystery that must not be misunderstood as such as the Romans wanted to to deem these people as more underdeveloped than they actually were, because we're just jealous of the fact that they had been kicked out of there, and that we know pretty damn well by any historical by any archaeological standard that was the actual reality of a land covered largely in forests, in swamps. Considered that also the part that the Romans had actually conquered was exactly the worst from that profile, right? It was the Germans of the forests that were naturally less developed. Also, that the Elbe ones, the moors opened, where there was a great. In fact, the Swabian Confederacy was in that place. That's also partly why the Romans underestimated them, because objectively they didn't think much of them. I mean, honestly, before the Battle of Söderburg Forest, these were just a tribe like any other. This is what we have to accept, to enter in our mind. It was nothing specifically, at that point, especially after the destruction of the Cimbrians and the Teutons and Caesar's campaigns. The Romans had gotten past this Germanic nightmare that from that had remained a bit from Teutonic times, and had made the political fortune also through propaganda of the popular side of Marius, of Caesar himself, that had largely that had propagated this idea that they had been the ones to defeat the terrible Germans. And these were objectively fierce peoples, right? They had represented an important threat, absolutely nothing capable of overthrowing Roman rule. We know that the Romans scrambled at the Battle of Söderburg Forest. They feared that the Germans could launch a raid into Italy and so on, but it didn't happen. And also what would have been the purpose of it on the long run, right? Aside from the fact that the Romans did retaliate, and they even went close to another disaster that could be of greater magnitude, even in the Battle of the Söderburg Forest. But obviously the Germans didn't have any specific long-term strategy of any sort to even think to I don't know what. I can't even say it. What did they want to do? To invade the Roman Empire? Of course not. And even later times and later centuries are something completely different in nature, and also probably overly dramatized if you look at the graduality of it, and still the capabilities of the Roman Empire. But that's another thing we talked about in other videos. There is an important standard that we can trace in here between Gaul and Germany. Gaul, objectively for ancient standards, was very rich, right? It still hadn't evolved up to the, developed to the point of, urbanization. It was something embryonal happening, but the Romans conquered it and built basically on the same base. That was a land that we know was conquered, as we were saying before, dramatically quickly, and also represents one of the single greatest accomplishments of Romanization. Gaul is just after Italy, historically speaking, the single most, in terms of Latin legacy and of properly of political and social institutional stability in the Middle Ages and so on. It's really a success, right? We will not spend here many words on the concept of Romanization, but naturally this was about co-opting the elites, eventually extending citizenship, full Roman citizenship to the rest of the people, proper, mostly participating through military service to the Roman state. The Gauls, the Celts, and also partly the Germans, as we will see today, for example, with the Batavians, had this great role also, in fact, as auxiliaries, as important troops, even just quantitatively speaking. I mean, by the 1st century AD, most Roman legionaries came at least from the Gallic provinces, right? Which means that they were, in part, still technically, the descendants of Roman colonists, but there was an increasing amount, naturally, of Romanization, probably of ethnic Celtic people. So we know this, but the concept here, if you want to picture a bit of difference between the Celts and the Germans, is that the Celts were a more aristocratic society, more stratified society. For example, cavalry was most important. The Celts had a great passion, we could easily say, for horses. They were not horse riding people that we could say for the Scythians and so on, but they had, quantitatively speaking, a lot of cavalry. Now I will repeat the thing that apparently triggered someone, but I can't. I even went against this person when making sarcasm on the thing, but I will repeat it because there is nothing ideological in it. Is that the Celts had this large amount of cavalry. It was used renowningly also by the Romans in auxiliary terms, just as the Spanish one and so on. But individually, they were great horsemen. There is no doubt about this. But the collective quality of their cavalry, as normally these tribal realities were, wasn't that much, right? So even this myth of the greatness of Gallic cavalry is a misunderstanding, mostly deriving from the same Roman sources about the fact that Gallic cavalry had posed a threat, mostly because the Gauls had it sometimes. The Germans, and the Romans didn't. Also, the Germans, as a matter of fact, had a very few cavalry at this time, which is a bit maybe overly stressed. But the point here is that the Celts had at least a more, what you can't even see embryonally speaking, as a chivalric world. I mean, the idea that the guy who fights on horseback is properly a knight. Usually the elite is armored, etc. In Germanic warfare, is a few armor. Telling the truth, it's a materially poor dimension. Armor was, probably confined just to bodyguard units or a few, elements of nobility fundamentally. That even in here was not dramatically armored in many ways. This properly informed also the nature of other Germanic. One of those few distinctive weapons in some ways, for example, these proto-Saxons that look mostly like falchions in a way, that you can't, more than what the Sax would evolve like towards the migration era, that are a most obviously effective weapon against unarmored troops like mostly the Germanic ones were. And it's interesting too because the reason here, that the realization that Germanic warfare was very intense, and it was very focused on infantry warfare especially, that knew some forms of diversification over time. It seems that compared to the Celts, the Germans were less reliant on this great immediate, complete wall rush against enemy lines. I mean, they would do it equally. And actually, the Romans knew that the hard way, because the Germans, especially throughout the centuries, the more they advanced, the more they grew, the more they came out of literally a prehistorical context. Increased the importance of a charge, even mixing it with these heavy javelins that they developed on the base of the Roman ones, reaching the same level of penetrability. But this is towards late Roman times. This times most of their weapons were light spears / javelins, but they were, let's say, more considerate. They had a greater cohesion, which is important to stress the fact that while the Celts would, with all the exceptions of the case, mostly charge all together en masse because they couldn't hold the ground for much longer. This is what at least ancient sources tell us. The Germans were more resilient. Like they were much more, much more compact, cohesive, as literally as units, as military groups all together. Mostly were tribal, clanic realities that didn't have a great deal of, as we've seen, they didn't conceive a much wider, political horizon. But as far as they were concerned, they were used to fight and to maintain their own unity by sheer practice. Naturally, the average Germanic warrior was just like used to raiding warfare, right? Because that's what was fundamentally most of Germanic warfare like. We actually know from Tacitus that there were important battles also between the same Germans. There was even a certain level of ritualization, especially these major clashes. And we know enormous bloodbaths even among them in that sense, but they are rare, right? And what we see mostly is this form of warfare that the Romans actually equated to the what they called as the latrocinium. That is literally what the brigands, because remember the criminality of the sword, the warband. That's what fundamentally they were, and mostly they escaped the agreement of the idea of the battle, of what the Romans could have with Fides, but also that the Germans has started by a certain standard to develop in a civilized sense of the idea of let's give battle en masse. And this because the larger armies are, the more they tend to agree on the place of the battle, the conditions where they are going to fight. We've studied this in the Infantry. It's not much of a cultural. I mean, it becomes cultural, but it's a consequence of a more advanced reality. But the average warfare here is raiding, is mostly cattle raiding, is pillaging, exterminating, raping, enslaving on a regular basis. Right? There were peoples who were fundamentally even just remembered, such as the Longobards, for example, that appear even after a few people know that after the fall of the Cherusci, that was fairly sudden, the Longobards for a while in the 1st century AD maintained a certain order in Germany, albeit they were renownedly a tiny tribe. But the point is that they, according to the other, they took pride from being at war, literally from every single with any single surrounding tribe. So moral of the story, do not be the Longobard neighbor. And that had this greatest ferocity, that as also what Timerius met them actually on the Elbe River. The sources say these were fiercer than the Germanic ferocity for which the Germans were famous in that regard. The thing of the ethnonyms that I began before I didn't end. For example, the Longobards are one of the very few Germanic peoples that maintain their ethnonym throughout history. All these other tribes basically disappeared ethnonymically speaking. They flowed into something else. For example, the Franks were largely these northwestern tribes. Some of them had participated also to the Battle of Suitable Forest en masse, because technically, these guys sent troops from everywhere, right? The idea of the comitatus, of these war bands of thugs, of young men that went out just for the pure necessity of killing a people and taking its place and its women and to dwell in there, because that was the only way they could support their demographic growth, was based on sending all these war bands around to get practice. I mean, when there is the big war, you want to send those guys there because those are gonna get skilled, and in this fierce competition between bands of thugs that spend their lifetime killing each other, at the point that this context is so mentally brutal that there are people, famously enough, that are still part of the, say, most extreme comitatus, in a sense, that is what you see also in the form of wolf or bear wars or these things that are conceived as literally possessed by the animal guide, the animal spirit that is also the mostly anodinic creature, which means that these people are devoted to their own death, right? That's the concept. I mean, these guys have such a few political and social structures to, strengthen their military system, that the only possibility they have is to dramatically boost the individual combativity, which is never a great thing, right? We cannot see this as a great accomplishment. And in fact, in the case of the Germans, what is really more striking is the capacity of the tribes as a whole, that instead represent mostly the I don't know, the mundane, if you want, because literally that was another world detached from it, a community of the farmers that took their own shield and spear and javelins and went to fight for the local chieftain and so on. These other guys are basically outcasts, right? So much that the berserker, the ulfadards, and all these things will become, in a more civilized context at the end of the Viking Age, just recognized for what they actually were, and what the Romans had recognized them for, and the Scandinavians now were doing themselves, that were simple brigands. What do you think these people were? There was something magic, fairish about. These were devout brigands that spent their own life pillaging, killing, exterminating in the most horrifying ways, sacrificing people alive, burning women, children. I mean, that was the only possible horizon in which they could survive. Some of them made it big in the sense they were either, recompensated with a, by their chieftains by their military leaders. Let's say they could become chieftains at a point, and settle down with some land and so on, with slaves and so on. But the moral horizon is that one. Right, if you're born in Germany at that time, you know that your tribe can be wiped out. Aside from the feuds between the clans that regularly also assassinated each other, that was a pleasure. But properly, your own tribe, if it doesn't go there and stands its ground and maintains this fierce cohesion, for which you must be willing to sacrifice your life, can be wiped out. Do you understand what it means? Your wife raped, your children cut to pieces, and this is what happened, I repeat it, on a regular basis. So just think from a mental point of view, and this is interesting because we have other indicators that talk to us about their stories, and during the migration era, when these people settled down, we know from their art, for example, they had a I don't know in psychiatric terms today what could be defined like, but they had a traumatic, dramatic, dark, obscure view of the world. They basically conceived the universe in this reality in which there were limbs just torn apart by primordial snakes that devoured people, and it was something unspeakable, right? We cannot properly talk, and that was already a very different context, a more advanced one than Augustan times. The Germans of Augustan times are anthropologically considered really also very importantly for the history of warfare, which is documented in this sense, fortunately enough, thanks to the Romans. Literally the warfare of a prehistorical population. This is how they are studied today. That's the thing. That's the point. And prehistorical doesn't mean that, I don't know, they lived in caves, right? When people address these topics, we use terms like barbarian, like prehistoric. That's literally what it is. I mean, barbarian is a broader cultural assumption that is the non-Roman, but it's not necessarily, from a Roman perspective, loaded with negative ideas, right? On the contrary, as we have seen, the Romans have naturally as a wall, an average Roman legionnaire said, what are these fuckers like? I mean, you have a very intelligent thing to do is to picture the Roman conquest of Germany as, in the context of, I don't know, the Teutoburg battle, as something like Iraq 2008. Right, not that bullshit that they made in the fiction Barbarians. That is probably one of the most overwhelmingly, incapable representations that have been depicted of those realities. You can equate that to the mindset of a Roman legionnaire to one of the U.S. Marines says, "What the fuck have we come here to die for?" Essentially, and that's it. And with constant attacks, ambushes, but it would have been much better to make a fiction like Barbarians, which is utterly despicable. First of all, from an artistical, I never complain from terms of historical accuracy, but here it seems like to look at the Indians and blue coats. I mean, let's be honest. It's the guys who wrote that thing, and I don't want to say that they were in bad mentality, but aside from the cliches and the dichotomic good and evil thing, is how cool it would have been to make a series in which you represent Germany 9 AD as Iraq 2008, right? That would have been freaking amazing. They didn't do it. They lost this huge opportunity, and hopefully someone will do it at some point. But the point I'm making here is literally to make you understand the contrast of the story. I mean, the fact that the Germans seemingly, we often, and I also said sometimes, that they didn't really want to be Romanized, broadly meant. Actually, it seems even in here, and that's why Tacitus also probably exaggerated about the primitive nature of Germany. Surely it was a tough land, and if the Romans abandoned them, if Augustus deliberately said, okay, let's stop the Rhine, also Caesar had said fundamentally that. You can be sure that whatever you think of whoever you are, those people knew far better than you what was the deal at the time, right? But during the 25 years of Roman domination, the Germans did cooperate at a level, right? Actually, it was a difficult thing, right? It was a gradual process of Romanization, but there were important successes. Also because the Romans came to rule parts of the Germans, right? Think about the Ubi, famously enough, or the Batavi, right? Those were, the Ala Ubiorum, even in today's Germany, there is a deep, west of the Rhine, there is a deep pride in, belonging to our reality as being Romanized. I mean, they think of the Germans that just live 1 meter east in completely different terms. Ala Ubiorum, for example, is one of the single most successful examples in history of Roman Roman Germanic integration, right? The Trier, a city like Augusta Treverorum, still by the 8th century, proudly, we have sources of this, said, we are Romans. Trier, right? That is also being exalted as a pride of, because it was allegedly an ever more ancient city than Rome. The Romanity was deeply felt. Think about Segestus, Arminius' brother, that called his son Italicus, and it was a Roman centurion, a Roman officer. So, here we're talking about a reality that, I repeat, we have as a Western civilization. These are things that are written on every history book. I repeat it, that Western civilization has forgotten of it. Today, once again, it seems like we're dealing with Native Americans and blue coats, right? That's not the mindset of which you have to frame this reality, right? But it's important to stress the optional aspect of this all, right? There was nothing deterministic about the conquest or the loss of Germany. That theoretically we could have had a Romanized Germany. We could have had a different migration era. We could have had different developments. And how the Germans, and we have explained this a lot of times, the ones from the right bank of the Rhine were Romanized in the process. The Roman legions that were stationed along the Rhine were not inside the Roman Empire, and those other guys that were outside. They were controlling both Gaul and Germany in a way. And we know that the integration of Germans went on since the very first contact, at least since Caesar, mostly actually. Think about the German cavalry we're talking a while, or the Germani corporis custodes of Augustus, right? There is a long tradition of Roman-German cooperation, as much of conflict and war and a hell of open warfare, right? I would like to add that naturally, as far as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, the Battle of Idastavizus, and so on, we will talk about them, right? We will talk about all of them. We will talk about Arausio. We will talk about everything. We will talk about the various typologies of Germanic troops. We will dedicate a video for each and every of these things, and even more, because there is to add also all the manualistic part of Roman history and so on. We were talking about the importance of infantry over cavalry, right? The idea that even the Germanic oligarchies weren't obeyed. They were fundamentally respected by the freemen, but they weren't slavishly obeyed like was happening in Gaul, where the average freeman was actually turned into a serf in many ways. It was just a peasant that worked for the lord, for the tough, Celtic chieftain that was a hell of a fighter, but the rest of the people weren't fundamentally that much. The Germans instead had this tough core of freemen that naturally embodied the bulk of infantry. Every single people in sedentary Europe had more infantry than cavalry, but the Germans seemingly were amongst the ones that had actually the least cavalry of all. But they had, right, they were mostly, as we've seen, the nobility. There was specifically an equestrian culture in Germany that has been a bit overshadowed by this primate of infantry, but that is at the root of the broader Indo-European passion for horses, equestrian deities, something we find in Greece, in Rome, in Gaul, everywhere, right? All of these peoples were obsessed with cavalry, contrarily wise to what is commonly believed. Actually, the Romans had pretty damn good cavalry. Just they had a few, and they prefer to use, in terms of cost-benefit ratios, this other troops here. I mean, it's overwhelmingly famous that passage in the Bello Gallico in which Caesar gives to the Germanic cavalry that he had hired as mercenaries the horses of the Roman equites, of the Roman knights, right? Because the German horses apparently were, as sources said, ugly, small, and kind of not as beefy, and like for example the Gallic breeds were very fine ones. And these German cavalrymen, that what also begins the fortunate tradition of German bodyguards and so on in the Roman army and in the empire, manage to defeat the Gallic cavalry, which is a very interesting thing, because as far as the quality of these cavalries were concerned was collectively low, right? Individually they were good cavalry, and we have explained many times, but collectively they didn't have the structures to perform who knows what. And the relatively small difference between Gauls and Germans from this point of view is revealed exactly by this, that the Germans, the German cavalry was much more warlike minded, where they were very aggressive minded as we've seen, everything was, since they had a few means even just to hold the ground for long. They had naturally a small logistic. They all invested for this very reason on the attack, right? This is very important because it informed the world warfare even in future times. This is what the Romans recognized all the time. These guys didn't have the logistical structures to maintain a large army for a prolonged time. So everything was about spending the resources immediately so that they would get over with it, and hopefully for investing the enemy with this enormous force. But after spent that, it was over. Well, the Germans managed to, we can't say that Caesar made it in Gaul because of his Germanic cavalry, right? Because this Germanic cavalry was turned out to be pretty damn good in that context against the Gallic one, so much that they defeated it many times and allowed the Romans, that were importantly basically was Caesar's private army as a warlord in Gaul, so they didn't have all the necessary resources, so much that in fact this cavalry was very important during the Vercingetorix period, where the Gauls were uniting, were carrying out a scorched earth strategy against Caesar, and that was literally the worst. And so Caesar also had to conclude fast for many reasons. Well, the Germans made the Romans win. They were surely not the decisive factor. It was about the Roman legions of the time and this now secular century-old tradition of military capacity and logistical engineering capabilities and so on. But if it hadn't been for them, even at battles like Alesia or so on, the Romans might have not made it, actually. And history here would have changed dramatically. So this cavalry also seemingly wasn't particularly fast. Simply, Germany was not such a great ground for breeding horses, like Gaul was eminently. Even Italy, albeit they had just a few. The Germans of the eastern boundaries that fundamentally were bordering the Scythian area probably had something more important. Also, we know this from, for example, surely the Swabians had more cavalry, and also just by political and social certification, they had more powerful elites. We see it. The Marcomannic cavalry, for example, was feared by the Romans legitimately. Actually, if you wonder what the Romans were doing in Germany in the first place, it's not that they cared about the western part where that was eventually the revolt. They just wanted to take out the Marcomanni because those were a thorn in the side, not to say else. They wanted to attack with the pincer movement, and just the Illyrian revolt prevented that, and then the Teutoburg Force happened. So, but that was, we can't see it. A more ever more cohesive people. Like the Western Germans were relatively more primitive than them. Even in here, there were not dramatic differences in any kind, but surely the eastern you go, the more you find cavalry in Germanic armies. But it's really a few, numerically speaking. So also collectively, they don't function very well, but they are tremendously warlike. They are tremendously aggressive-minded, as we've seen, and they can rush on the enemy. They were very fit, right? They were constantly exercised. In fact, the fact that I don't know, there's this cliche that the Gauls were able to perform this remarkable stunts on horseback and the Germans didn't, has, in my opinion, a very few to do with the actual quality of these troops. Aside from the fact that the Germans, I mean, from an individual point of view, because aside from the fact that the Germans, like in the training process of their warriors, were literally torturing them and literally sacrificing them. For example, they made young boys running across, spears, and that's really how they also did this initiatic rites. Even in the comitatus, were something utterly brutal. I mean, we know that it was already still in the Celtic world, especially in the outer fringes. In the Germanic world, this is the point. You enter the comitatus, your life does not belong to you anymore. You're exclusively devoted to the deity of war. And every once in a while, they would even take out some of them to prove the fact that you were completely personalized, right? you didn't exist as a person anymore. You were just an extension of the deity, and that's exclusively how they lived, right? As far as the Comitatus was concerned, at least. And these German cavalrymen were mostly part of those bands of criminal thugs that lived exactly in that fashion, right? There is all properly an equestrian tradition, even in the Odinic culture, that is often overlooked. In my opinion, the Germans did the same exact things on horseback if they could. These guys evidently were better than the Gauls for winning against them, right? It's not the Roman mounts that were probably similar to the Gallic ones at this point, but probably how combative they were. So there is also another thing to consider, that it's a bit maybe wargamistic, but the fact that, for example, the Celts, and especially the nobility that used to serve on horseback, and not always, by the way, and we will talk about this in a while, also for the Germans, were better armored, would render the even the kind of fighting on horseback fundamentally different. For example, cavalry is notoriously exposed to missile, right? So the fact that the Germans were so dramatically unarmored had to make them mostly specialize in this turning left and right with the shield to parry eventual bolts, right? Which is something that I don't think that the levels of individual training couldn't profitably develop in this sense, right? It's also true that the heavier a Celtic chieftain could be, and the least evolutions he could perform on horseback, right? So you understand everything is very relative. And as far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty open to the idea that even German cavalrymen were capable of amazing stunts on horseback. However, there is also another thing. Consider the Celtic saddle of horn. That was basically this, in fact, 4-horn, piece of horn, horn specifically. That also the Romans adopted famously enough, so that when you went on horseback, these things was flexible, and the 4 horns enclosed with the weight of the body around your hips. So obviously it sucked because they didn't have stirrups. They just, in the ancient world also, they didn't have proper shoeing. They had just the hippo sandals. It was something, they did charge like hell, right? In the ancient world they did it, but it's obviously very different from from what, I don't know, medieval cavalry would become. So the Germans instead didn't, and actually they thought that whoever used a saddle was effeminated, right? And allegedly they charged them on sight, exactly because they said, look at those fucking bastards, they are using a saddle, what pussies they are, and they would attack. This is the version that we have of the story, literally, right? Consider that the concept of, I usually avoid this kind of sexist talk, but it's literally what the sources say, so I can't say it. But this idea of femininity and masculinity is very important, right? Aside from the fact that these societies weren't at all free, like the sexual roles were those ones, and if you came out of them, they drowned women into swamps if they went out of the traditional role. But the idea is that literally you are a man because you're a warrior and a freeman. So it's all connected to it. In many also interesting cultural anthropological ways, the spear, the sword, is the virile symbol of the man. It's all one, right? There are, even in the ancient world, brutal things like, for example, these were overwhelmingly superstitious societies. The Romans, for example, cut off the genitals of enemy warriors as talismans. I'm not kidding. These things were done because it was believed that the essence of manhood and war was something precious, was something magic, that it could protect you from evil, right? The same custom that it will be also famous for the migration era of drinking from an enemy's skull, obviously after having cleaned it of all the other soft parts, boiling it and so on. But using it as a cup was not, technically an insult to the person, because you would never do that with a slave, because technically the slave is not even a human being. You would do it with the chieftain, with the enemy chieftain that you had slain with your hand, and you could drink from the hand, because that was the seat, or whatever these guys believed was the spirit. I don't know. Think about the Celtic warriors that severed the heads of their own fallen companion, but also the ones of the enemy, but especially for their companions when they went to fight in these raids in faraway lands, to bring back, at least they couldn't carry the corpse altogether, they just embalmed the head and brought them to wherever they came from. So you have to enter even in this level of relation with that, with the all the Odinic cult is based on necrophagous animals, is based on literally the death of Odin, that becomes he who is the connection between the world of the dead and the living, because he literally hangs himself. Incidentally, naturally the Germans didn't have a statal discipline, right? Of course, it was a kind of a public assembly that was all private in nature, in the sense that everything was recomposed through via feuds, right? Clans killed each other, as we've seen abundantly, in order to solve matters, to recompose the offenses and so on. But in terms of discipline, the Romans, I don't know, an average Roman proletarian went to enlisted as a legionnaire, and it was literally psychophysically brutalized in a way that only a state like the Roman one had become could enforce with utter violence and complete contempt of human mercy, just to transform these guys in pure killing machines that would slaughter, as we've seen, literally everybody in some place. When the Romans always told, this is told by themselves, put in the voice of barbarians in the stories, created, said that it was said that they first they create a desert and call it peace. We know, archaeologically speaking, that it's literal, right? The solitudo in Latin is literally that there's nobody there anymore alive, and we know it happened, right? The Romans didn't do it with everybody, but with those that served, as we've seen they did it even in parts of Germany, at least, because the Germans were many also as a people. But what I was saying, and that's what they increased properly their manpower, but what I was saying is that it was the clan that, in substitution of the state, because that was the most identifiable reality. It was not even the tribe, right? Because the tribe was already with that shift, and it was that guy, I don't like him, he wants to impose itself on it. It was the clan, it was the extended family, right? And these solidly patriarchal groups, like even here, it was similar to all the world at that point. Matriarchal societies are extremely rare in the history of mankind. Think about the Roman paterfamilias. These were rigidly patriarchal in military societies. That's also why the Romans and the Germans actually understood each other at some levels, like others, by the way. It's not that the Celts, were different in that regard. But the idea is that the clan and all those who composed them, not just the family leader, but everybody acted morally in a way that substituted that collective discipline in such a way, for example, that if a Germanic warrior fled the battlefield, let's say, or lost his shield, etc., he was literally dead in front of society. It's very similar, actually, to the concept of the devotio in the Latin thing. That is, when the Roman commander devoted himself to the infernal deities to win the battle, giving his life in sacrifice. If he didn't die, he was technically dead. So there was all, eventually the Romans, it was all a complicated way to get around it. But originally, it was the same identical thing, like with the Germans. That is, that if you covered yourself with shame, you fled the battlefield, you were dead in front of your family. We know that the Germanic women would stop talking. They would stop even looking at these people. Just think, you're dead for your family, in front of your family. You're dead universally. You're dead in front of the gods. You're in front of reality. That is the reality of that man. It's so much that it is said that these people, by the Roman sources, said that these people, most of the times, they didn't have anything else to live for, and they hanged themselves. and that was a way to maintain collective discipline, right? And that's what we find in the broader tactics also, as we'll see now in a while. These were literally families fighting with relatives side to side, right? And they exploited that in the absence of a broader collective training, because that it was at least binding them. It was bonding them, I mean, to maintain the field, because you were fighting literally for your father, for your brother, for your son, and whatever. So the main weapons, as we've seen, of the Germans were light spears and javelins. Swords were not universal, definitely. There is a bit this cliche that every Celtic warrior technically had one at some point. It doesn't seem to be so, but surely the Celtic world had more of these equipment. The Germans, as we've seen, were they were poor materially, and they would do with spears, which is not necessarily worse, especially considering the tactics that they performed. Swords were generally speaking good, right? At least, those who had them were mostly chieftains who could afford the best most of the time. So we're talking about good, we can't call it steel, but even for today's metallurgical standards, it's not even, but chemically speaking, it was. The Germans had, in this sense, good swords. It's just they had a few, right? And they were mostly used for cutting. Even in here, similarly to the Celtic swords, also because they were identical, let's be honest. They were designed to mostly fight from horseback. Something that I didn't say before is that universally, and this is something we rarely address, I rarely see it explained, is that in the ancient world, and especially among these populations, a bit all over Europe, aside in the sedentary one, fighting on horseback was actually considered cowardly and feminine. This is very important to understand certain societies. I mean, the same concept for which the freemen in the Celtic world would lose importance towards the first century BC. Look at Gaul, chiefly. I mean, Britain was different because Britain was more still kind of heroic in nature, in culture, military culture, but was also compensated by a different way of life for the same elite that now didn't care to fight on horseback anymore, also because there was nobody preventing them anymore. Instead, we know that the German chieftains, mostly, either if they came on battlefield mounted, they dismounted, or they were even forced to dismount by the freemen, because they said, what the hell are you doing? If you fight on horseback, you can't leave, you can run away, you fight alongside with us, because we are all equal, in theory, right? Everybody's equal as long as they have something to benefit from it, of course. Most of this equality was stressed just by the oligarchies in many ways. But as we've seen, even the freemen had this dramatic importance, and considered that this is, was literally based on our strength of forces, because the freemen could easily turn the spears against the oligarchs in the ratio of power. We know it was done. Think about the Battle of Strasbourg. It was also much later than this, but still, right? So you can imagine at this time. So in fact, Arminius at some point even did it, right? So there was something about that world was changing in a way that wasn't specifically what this world had used to be. So you can imagine, even within these societies, the debate revolving around this. Think about how just even the Roman conquest shattered this whole system. Like, it's not that you go, I can't say that, the conquest of Germany and the Battle of Teutoburg Forest had literally the same importance for the Germans as the Second Punic War had been for the Romans. But you understand the similarities, don't you? Like, there is something there that has begun, and something that will not stop, that things will never come back as before. Also, from the other side, there are the Romans. There's always this continuous contact, this continuous exchange and osmosis, also practices of equipment and so on. Just think that even some of the most iconic armies of weapons of the migration era, seemingly, were actually that the Germans used were actually Roman derived. The Francisca was actually not a Germanic weapon. It stemmed from the ones used in the Roman army, seemingly. Even the famous Danish axe in later times, actually, it was used by other people. Those adopted them just to, we call them Danish, but there was very few of it. The same goes, think about the Angun, right? These other heavy javelins that the Germans they didn't have it. These are all things that basically mutated from the Romans. So the Germans were kind of pure, were kind of virgin at that point, still, and that's why they're so fascinating, because you can't see really something different from even just what you can observe in the Celts. Also in terms of timeline, because these are also, relatively better documented times than before. And there wasn't much difference between the original Celts and the original Germans. As a matter of fact, the same Celts inhabited Germany originally, right? So even about those things today, who are the Celts, who are the Germans? Let's be honest, this is all an ethnographical invention. And there were differences based on the settling in different places, but they were not so schematic as the Roman historiography made them. Just roughly. As we've seen, armor was not very common. Helmets were rarer and still and probably limited to chieftains. Also, there's absolutely nothing strange to see a Germanic chieftain equipped like a Roman legionnaire. Let's be honest about this. I mean, that's it, right? The Romans have been there 25 years. There are people who speak Latin that that fought for the Romans. Like, let's not the Ubi, the Batavians. Those are Germanic troops in the Roman army, and they fight as the Romans. They have the same Roman equipment, right? Also, famously enough, like, there was no difference in line of principle between the potential weapons equipped by given to a legionnaire and the one given to an auxiliary, especially considering that the auxiliaries were mostly fighting in the stead of the legionnaires, so they would get the best weapons. And if you're interested especially about the Batavians, we'll talk about later. We made a video about the Battle of the Graupius Mountains, in which these Batavians, the Germanic auxiliaries of Rome, win almost alone the battle against the Caledonians, as basically spearmen, largely, right? And that tells you how tough they were. Now we pass to, in fact, to the infantry, which is the most interesting part in many ways, also as far as the tactics are concerned. And we will talk about that also specifically in other videos, but here giving a general idea. First of all, there was an important deal of light infantry, as is in many, like in all the other peoples at the time. These were the younger elements of society. Just physically speaking, when you're young, you're more elastic, you're more agile, and therefore what a best role than the skirmisher. That is also a hell of a risky business, sometimes much riskier even than the spear, but the shield wall, because that either you lose the battle, so it breaks all together and everybody's done for, so there's not much of a difference. But if you win, mostly the losses are not going to be so many. The skirmishers instead fight in roles that are very dangerous, and that, especially in Germany, where pitched battles were very rare, at least rare, let's say, maybe without exaggerating. The habitual role of these troops was perhaps in part shared largely by also the regular infantrymen, right? What is rightfully said about these Germans is that they knew surely their own land, these paths. They had special even gear, shoes, and so on to cope with this pretty difficult German terrain in the forests, in the marshy areas. I mean, they surely knew the land. There were people that were at much greater contact with nature than even the Celts had become, in a way, right? There were Celtic settlements that had become proto-urban in a way. Also, the countrysides were more developed, more civilized in a way. The Germans lived in this wild reality. And so, naturally, only light infantry functions well in certain contexts. And as we've seen, the young men were specifically chosen, selected, trained in that brutal fashion that we can't even speak of for the decency of human sensitivity. And there was a fierce competition among them to become part of the retinue of the most prestigious chieftains. This happened with this specific role that naturally could entail also infantry, but also revolved importantly around cavalry. Naturally, as we've seen, the German cavalry was mostly made up of the elite. So the highest in the political and social value, the more desirable it was for these young men that had the guts to, by the way, go into what those men went to, was to follow them. So, given that this cavalry was also not that much, it was needed that for some skirmishers to fight alongside it. Also, we know with some effect, because basically these light troops had to run pretty fast, so also they had necessarily to be skirmishers or lightly equipped troops in general. Not that the Germanic infantry was dramatically loaded in gear, as we've seen, but technically there is the important difference between those who can stand the ground and those who, as skirmishers, can't. That would attack the enemy cavalry during the melee, in fact on foot. Naturally, this was symmetrical in Germanic armies, something that probably happened among other peoples, but the Germans are mostly credited for it. There is more evidence for this. The Romans usually didn't do it. At least, there could be a mutual support, but this could, produce itself in the melee. It was not a standard practice, but it still happened also in the Roman army, telling you the truth, at certain levels. And it was functional to support cavalry, to take out enemy horses. This is often done in many contexts, not just in the ancient world, but so the role was also taking out the escort of the other cavalry, so these other skirmishers and so on. We can imagine these guys being equipped simply with javelins and shield or a knife or something. Naturally, they could not stand up to an enemy cavalry charge, right? But they could hurl their javelins at enemy charging or being charged by their own cavalry, and afterwards envelop their flanks or pass through to hamstring the enemy mounts. And in the absence of their light infantry, some of the cavalry might dismount to fight on foot instead, as we've seen. Which is something that, even if you look at the migration era and, the Strategicon and so on, it was often the case for German cavalry itself, especially when they were in desperate situations, but preferably they were more comfortable to fight on foot, and that's what their societies expected, as we've seen, because a true warrior, especially a true chieftain, fights on foot. And this is exactly the place the chieftains would have in the regular deployment, right? They were usually deployed in the midst of the infantry formation in the front, sometimes in the point of the edge of the wedge formation that they created, so like the pig's snout one that is to be found, famously enough. The Germans had this dramatic charging capability. If you look at the Battle of Arausio, that was lost by the Romans mostly because of this poor leadership, that the split command. The Germans basically defeated the Roman army in detail, right? So that's actually the major Germanic victory, as we've seen, as far as relatively pitched battle is concerned, but we do not have evidence of this for centuries and centuries. The Germans naturally favored mostly ambushes. They stayed away because the Romans had simply the edge in open field, better infantry, better cavalry, more missile power, so just a fool would go out to fight with them, unless they were really a lot of people, like in the case of Ariovistus and so on, and it was tough for the Romans actually to defeat them, right? Consider that the Romans are not always, perfectly, in perfect situation. That's what the enemy's looking at in any. That's why warfare is asymmetrical by definition in any single historical context. Symmetrical warfare has never existed historically, but and because these, let's picture in this way. In the ancient world, I mean, there are not dramatic differences in cavalry. I mean, if you look at the Roman legion, essentially they're swordsmen, right? Germans are spearmen. They're it, right? Everything is based. The real discriminant is collective training, but the Romans also have better equipment. For example, their infantry is all armored at this point, which the Germans not, right? But also they fight in a different way. For example, the German shields they're not so concave like the Roman ones, or not even as the Celtic ones. This is an interesting thing we have to also to analyze at some point, because the evolution also of the German shield is to create most of this shield wall more than the individual combat like, and we know that's exactly how they fought specifically. I mean, this relying on this broader interaction between this closely thickly packed infantry units and solid broad front. Absolutely, the myth that the barbarians fought clumsily and without order and formation is absolutely wrong, right? That's not the discriminant. That's what it's really the maneuvering, the discriminant. Of course, these guys were not much into maneuvering. They didn't have much of it, except maybe certain tribes that were recognized, and especially the ones, in fact, that were more exposed to Roman warfare. That they had a more orderly way of deployment, but they simply didn't have, as we've seen, that level of collective training given by the state, like in our professional army, like the Roman one was. So their thing was all about the courageous nature, the hardness of their formation, which is very different from the individualistic ethos. This is interesting because objectively it's different from the Celtic world, and there is in part a difference already in this. It's not dramatically different actually, and in fact, if you look at the Belgians, for example, that are the most Germanized of the Celts, if we can define them in this way, they have a hell of a tough infantry, right? Very much like the Germans in conceptually. So this resilience is not based simply on the rush, right? It's also in the resistance, also going back and forth, right? That there is this side of Germanic military culture that is fanatically based on the concept of courage and of resistance to the death and so on, but still there is another one that is present also in all military cultures that tells us something else, right? The idea that, for example, they didn't find particularly shameful to retreat, to make feint flights, to retreat momentarily, and in this maintaining all the cohesion of the formation. This is important, right? And also that they were, of course, into treachery. They also made their own use, for example, of missile troops that there is not an overwhelming amount of evidence about, also for similarly to other peoples like the Celts, but that actually was there, and it is to be found even just in the German epics. What is the hero normally killed by? Not in the duel, but by a treachery, right? That's the tragic destiny of the world that exemplifies pretty well what also most of these guys could die for. Also this javelin arriving from the back, right? And therefore in these contexts that are not just face-to-face combat, but it's something else. An importance of missile troops is important. So also shields at the beginning are not dramatically large. There is properly some different distinction we could make, but generally speaking, the German warfare is largely homogeneous, right? There is a change over time. If we know simply from a historical point of view that, I don't know, in Scandinavia, I mean, the northern Germans were let's say, less updated, obviously, than the continental ones, because the ones were simply more, the latter were simply more exposed to civilization, right? So they got before a certain type of equipment and so on. If you look, I don't know, at the time of the migration era, You look at a Gothic warrior, it's basically kept like a Roman legionary of the time. If you look at an Anglo-Saxon warrior, that's something technically closer to these original contexts: smaller shields, more hit-and-run tactics, and so on. So naturally, when I say that infantries were very compact, I'm talking here even in strategic situations that would allow such units to be employed. Otherwise, hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, right? The Battle of Teutoburg Force. You can't say that it's the greatest ambush in the history of warfare. That goes for the Transylvanian Lake by Hannibal, but it's still the ambush par excellence, and not only because that was also served by infrastructural, resources such as the walls. Think about even just in later times. So that makes you understand, for example, the importance of standing the ground, right? The idea of really entrenching yourself, so to avoid further the having to cope with such a thing like the Romans, that at this time are pretty damn dangerous and can't be defeated only if they're bottled up, caught in their way in a rainy, marshy reality in the forest. So a masterpiece. That, I mean, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest is amazing, and unfortunately, once again, in the fiction, barbarians, they had to ruin it. I don't even comment on that, but that's something I would like to see, but I would like to see for real, like all the 3 days and all the freaking development, not just like a. Well, let's skip that topic because it's ridiculous, but whatever. So what I was saying also, that the infantry was deemed, the Germanic infantry was deemed by the Romans as the most dangerous element. Right? It's as if you have this troops that, you see, as we were saying before, the true difference that was made between a context and another in Central Europe was really moral force, like in any other most of the times. These Germans didn't look advanced. They were armed in relatively modest ways, which doesn't mean ineffective ones, by the way. But they were what they were, and so on. So the Romans would even engage them with certain confidence. Often there were many, right? So the Romans had also naturally, as we've seen, qualitatively speaking, they had an edge. But what, in my opinion, was the real thing is that once engaged, these guys wouldn't break. Right, that's the thing. I mean, on the long run, you try to, you say, okay, well, we punch in that place with a cohort, and then we make a flank attack and so on. But I presume these troops kept fighting like to the death for real. I mean, they had this attritional capacity, right, even in open field, that would make the legionnaires sweat and die, naturally, in much greater proportion that it was expected. These were tough nuts to crack. And naturally the worst came mostly during ambushes and so on, but by definition an ambush is not what, on average, accomplishes the greatest of results. You can say Teutoburg, that's the exception that confirms the rule, but that's not a simple ambush, right? And there the Germans brought an enormous amount of people. Like, it was like a major battle. They also lost an overwhelming amount of troops themselves in the process, because it's not that the legionnaires also let themselves being chopped down. They fought to the death as well, because that's what they were designed for, technically, too. But if you refuse the battle and you recur to ambush, we have studied it in phone class, it's because you're declaring your tactical inferiority. And it's not just a tactical problem, it's literally that from a strategical point of view, you can do less. So much that, even after the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the few Roman escapes, it was enough for them to enclose themselves in those fortresses they had built over the Rhine. You can imagine it wasn't like these enormous things, but that was enough to keep the Germans out, right? Because they didn't have much else but to try to hit the Romans by putting them in the worst of conditions, because otherwise there wasn't much else to do against them, right? And these are the times in which properly it's even more difficult to do, because these are not the infantries of the 4th century. Right, the Alemanni in the 4th century were objectively the greatest threat on the western front. They were literally the strongest infantries that Rome had ever met up to that point. And surely since this beginning, these times, the Germans already figured pretty damn well. But that's because the Alemanni had increased. They were now confederacies proper. They weren't just tribes, first of all, so they had even a greater political weight. They had been Romanized in equipment. They had, a greater organization, and so on. So at this point, instead, it's really a big divide for ancient war standards between the Romans and the Germans, which makes, for example, the Battle of Judea Forest even more astonishing as a masterpiece. Like how Arminius made it to put all this together, those forces together, is utterly amazing. Right? It's one of those political accomplishments that are like, those guys made it. Right? Those guys earned it, and it costed to them a lot as well. But independently from this, the single tactical systems were still the ones that were. Right, so that, as we were saying before, aside from the Teutoburg disaster, it's not that the Germans won any major engagement in those centuries, or they accomplished that. They were what they were, like other peoples, by the way, so it's not a big deal, right? Consider that pitched battles, major clashes, that naturally, we have to be honest about this. Of course, there were many other battles that we do not know much, but the reason we do not know them is also because they were smaller, in part. So that's the thing. Surely the Germans defeated multiple times the Romans in pitched battles at some point, not just in the late Roman, I'm specifically talking about this early period. It's just we do not know them, because they were probably smaller. We do not have evidence of legions disappearing or something, right? So it was like, there was no challenge, broadly meant. The Germans, in that specific case, were fighting for the freedom in Germany. So it's a very different thing from posing a threat, as they would start doing since the Germanic Wars, and especially by the 3rd century. Mostly the Goths, that were also very much mixed now, but weren't much, the Germans as they were before. They were mixed also with Sarmatians and so on. So there were confederacies. These ones were not. Not even the Swabians, because technically the Swabians didn't fight. In that, if you look at Ariovistus, he was one of the leaders of the Swabians, but it was just a chunk on its own that wanted just to invade Gaul. And it's a different thing from just like all the Swabians moving. And actually, those movements of the migration era was set in motion by this aggregation of the Swabian Confederacy. So this great instability from this pole that objectively had, in fact, hegemonized, or at least controlled, mediated, catalyzed the movements of the other Germans, kept them in check. Once that collapses, it's a problem, and the Germans start moving. And the Romans get worried about that, also because they had a florid trade going on with the Germans, right? Roman and German economies were actually very intertwined. You would say, what mostly for? Well, Marcus Aurelius was about to invade Germany literally for yogurt. And I'm not kidding. One of the greatest problems was exactly that. They were concerned about the fact that yogurt trade would stop, and it was a major thing. Of course, it was not just because of yogurt, but that was an important aspect both for the trade exchange and so on, but specifically because together with the cut of trade, that was just a consequence of the broader political upheaval that was taking place in Germany. And it's unfortunate that we are so scarcely documented about this. As we were saying before, German tactics were dangerous because rather than the individual verve of the Gauls and the Britons, they emphasized determination and cooperation. We haven't talked also about the physical side. The Germans, as you know, were stereotypically very big, right, well-built, tough men that were properly had been selected by a tougher climate tougher lifestyle. They had also a greater proteic diet than other peoples. They probably fought for cattle, so it was literally hunting either for animals or men. And I can say they also ate men, because actually it's in all likelihood these things happened as well, but obviously for reasons that are a bit different from simply nourishment reasons. But literally, I mean, they mostly ate dairy products. Of course, they had also largely agricultural products, but the idea is that the freeman, the guy who owned the farm, the slaves and so on, didn't work the land and ate all the fats, the proteins and all this stuff, because those are the food that you need to grow big, tough, strong, and so on. And there was diet is important in these cases. The stereotype was that the Germans were kind of beefy, so they had very large muscles that could give all this energy at the moment, right? But that, differently from the Romans, they were less resilient. Muscles got thinner the more you increase endurance and so on. And it's different. Like, it's when you swim, your muscles grow in a certain way. When you go bodybuilding, they grow in another fashion. At least if you're searching for mass and so on. They probably mostly search for mass. As we were saying, these were hell of physicalities, right? But in fact, they were functionalized to that kind of fight, the charge. So literally, they had to break everything at the first impact, which means that they had these muscles. They had to pump like hell and smash as much as they could at a given moment, right? The Romans were instead for this, dramatically, and as we've seen, violently drilled men who could endure for a very long time. It thanks also to the fact that they trained also in a particular way themselves. The Romans were pretty robust themselves, telling the truth, just for the training. I mean, there wasn't telling the truth much. We know it anthropometrically speaking from Grace, from Fine. It's not that, in spite these words, the Romans weren't actually that short for ancient world standards, but definitely the Germans were among the tallest, if not the tallest. But the difference in height was a few inches, right? And not just because many legionnaires at that point would also be, Celtic or so on. Objectively, the Europeans were all pretty similar at that point. And the idea, however, here is a bit too stereotypical. The truth with with that cliche of the fact, for example, the Germans couldn't stand too much heat or even cold, right? And this is also true because, by the way, it's not because you live, in a colder climate that you resist cold better than another person. It doesn't work like that. Maybe your society is more, it's more capable of dealing with it in certain ways, of course, right? But physically speaking, that's exactly the same thing. The real thing is that yes, it's true that they were physically perhaps better suited for the big impact, so that after that they couldn't make it and they gave up. It is true. We've seen it also for the Celts and so on. While the other country, the other the Greeks, the Romans did something else. But the real this is just a consequence of the logistical capabilities. It's obvious that the Germans had to be like that. Why? Because it's not that the problem is that they got tired after the charge, right? The problem is that they had a few to sustain themselves for after the charge. Mostly had wine, beer, very caloric stuff, but they had it in a few number. The Romans were plenty of stocks, mostly, not always, by the way, because that doesn't come standard, especially in places like Germany that are difficult also to supply and so on. There are no roads. It's a freaking nightmare of a hellish nature. But the concept is still that they are more advanced in that regard, so they can resist longer on the field. This is something that is pretty well known. even just from the I don't know, the Byzantine manuals, and so the cliche was a bit all the same, but it was realistic given these standards, given these dynamics, right? So yeah, technically the Germans were tougher, they're taller, and they're scared. They were seen as something that as the terrible giants and so on. They are beautiful. This is the image that struck the Romans since the Teutonic migration, and even the Gauls allegedly feared the Germans in that. So this is that passage from Caesar when the legionnaires are told by the Gauls that because the Germans were arriving and the Romans were there in Gaul, and the Gauls told the Romans that these Germans were monsters, were so strong and tall and violent. And Caesar calls all the various centurions because he heard all the lamentations of the legionnaires that cried, that made testament because they feared to fight the Germans. And Caesar, obviously it's all rhetorical, says, "Oh, do not just like, what the hell is this? We have already defeated the Germans now." And obviously they go for it and they defeat the Germans, so they surpass. Caesar was important because he surpassed the Teutonic trauma, right? The Romans felt at some point overconfident about the same Germans after that, as also the conquest of Germany and the Battle of Silber Forest proved at many levels. But also history has a bit, let's say, insisted on these cliches, because also this is as far as the first wave is concerned. Then towards in Latin historiography, then towards late Roman times, you have the same cliches, but much more rhetorically depicted, also written by people that had a greater distance from even the military events, right? So it becomes literary, in fact. And then historiography went on with it, and there is some truth, as we've seen. Indeed, we know that the Germanic populations were taller and so on, but it wasn't literally what made the difference for it, and still they were some of the least effective military systems out there, as we've seen. And this is no opinion. They didn't have an army by professional statal standards, right? And this has nothing to do with the fact that they defeated the Romans, because history has proven even much more. Think about the Zulus. Think about other. We don't have to put other example. The fact that once one army defeated another in the Iron Age, big deal. What do you think cultures differed like dramatically, right? This is not a football game. Unfortunately, many people think that they can make it a football game, as if saying, haha, look at that, people was defeated by that other. Yeah, but you don't look at the picture and say that these guys basically didn't even dare to cope with the Romans in open field differently from not from many others. And telling you the truth, I mean, sometimes they did it themselves, but Rome was Rome at that point, guys. Let's be honest about the thing. Also, there were practical reasons for this rigidity and firmness of Germanic infantry, because the Germans rightly believed that speed in infantry could turn quickly into panic. It was difficult to keep these guys together, right? They had to rely on order, on patience. They had to be willing to withstand even attacks and so on, but not to compromise the order of the formation, right? So sudden charges and retirements were more appropriate to cavalry and light troops, while they tried their best for these infantry just to remain compact. It wasn't easy, and they didn't always succeed in it. There is evidence of certain lines that go back and forth, others that fought to the death, but surely it really was an enterprise for these people to start coping with this pressure, because let's be honest about it, it's like in other context, these guys had never seen anything like the Roman army before. So it was new for them. And it would be very interesting, in fact, to study this military history in a way it takes into consideration the novelty of the thing. As we've seen, the Germans also thought it no disgrace to retire, provided that you afterwards pressed on again, right? And always try to carry off their dead and wounded if defeated. This was important for them. Their favorite formation, as we said before, was the wedge, because this facilitated, in a way, the capacity of breaking into a single point of the enemy line. The wedge had in its head, as we've seen, the elite, right? So the rest had to make mass to expand, but the first guys in the front had to break through, and this had to be freaking beasts, right? Because you don't do that easily, especially against a Roman legion and so on. So these guys were loaded, as we were saying before, with an incredible energy, incredible strength, embodied by those relatively few troops that had even just equipment, for example, for doing it. It was not properly just, of course it was mostly a physical thing, but it actually was mostly a mental thing, to be honest. But in order to perform that against a reign of Pila, for example, you had to be pretty damned well equipped. And that's also why they rarely dealt with the Romans, because they knew that was freaking dangerous. But if they had to do it, the wedge was a very good option. There is also a specific there were specific weapons like the framea, right? There were also longer spears that suggests that, differently from the Celts, as we've seen before, these guys were properly increasing the stopping capacity with the spikes. That also were important, because as unarmored troops they had to keep out distant the enemy, right? That's, pole arms have always been used by the unarmored, because they don't want the armored that cuts you to pieces, since you are basically unarmored, to come to you, to approach, to close in, and to butcher you down. So there is this idea. Of course, the Germans had nothing like, the Macedonian phalanx or anything, so do not even think like something like this for a reason. But objectively, in this way, they could maintain very important positions. And spears have objective advantage, as long as, especially, they're used all together in a solid mass. So that's why it was so important to them, and also why they were so resilient, because it was difficult objectively to break through them in that way. And the framei were hurled like a shower against the enemy before the charge, right? So this was a pretty standard tactic that every people used. Actually, we now look at the Romans as the iconic thing of the pilum that is thrown before all. Why was that a thing? Because the Romans had a freaking in collective training that allowed that to do that as perfection so much. They had calculated the shapes and sizes of the pila perfectly at the second of the meters of distance from which to throw at the enemy that was charged. Just something incredible that was done. Not because the pilum was such this dramatic thing. There were other heavy javelins here and there. Look at Barry and so on. It's just that it's all about collective training. The Romans functioned better together, and hence, as a formation, they kicked ass. But every other people threw javelins before the charge. So it's not, as you understand here, it's really about the moral capacity, like this training, this confidence, and so on, that makes the difference. It of course, the Romans also had some of the finest equipment, but still they weren't dramatically different. Everybody, all these infantries in Central Europe around threw javelins, right? And not necessarily before the charge, or between a charge and another. These battles lasted for a long time, so even the same Romans sometimes used the pilum just to skirmish, especially the lighter one. And this is what they did between a pose and another. Swords were, present in this whole thing, but they had a secondary role, right? They were definitely less important than spears altogether for in the economy of combat, and also and they mostly were used in those situations where the spears had been broken. So it was either a prolonged melee, but mostly also during the defense. And it was the last resort. All these spears, some say that, for example, the Karuski and the Batavi had this greater capacity in thrusting with their spears, and that they were also longer. Yes, it is true, but only tendentially, right? It's not because they used dramatically different equipment from the rest of the Germans. They were actually using the same weapons. It's just that theirs were a bit more functionalized in that sense, because also as peoples they were kind of tougher, they were more exposed to the Romans also, and they were actually even fighting for the Romans, so they had learned more. They had probably also some greater cohesion and a greater quality of infantry that allowed them to exercise this, to stand their ground more often than what their eastern neighbors would do, right? Because even just holding the ground against the Roman army was a big deal, as we've seen. So these guys were more used to it, and they were more capable. The Cherusci famously are described as having a high level of discipline that is parallel to the Roman one, which is not nearly as true, but it's still very significant, because objectively it shows you how these peoples were growing in terms of military organization and capability. Right, and it's mostly about maneuvering that matters. It's not even about the weapons, right? It's more important how quickly you deploy and how much mass you can invest in interest of time. It's not about the weapon that you use that makes the difference. We're talking about the first, the first centuries AD. Come on, I mean, there is no technological difference that changes the outcome of battles, right? Not even when the Romans used catapults or stuff like that. It was still about the force of things like the spears, the swords, the missile. That's it, right? There is no magic weapon that solves battles for them. Naturally, thrusting weapons would be employed, while from the posterior ranks, javelins would pour on the enemy as well. Consider this was often done. In fact, as far as the Germanic tactics were concerned, there was this line of, there was this sense of segmentation, as we've seen with the cavalry. There was the cavalrymen and these retainers, this young men that fought to enter in the comitatus of the Great Chieftain and so on. But the battle line was specifically in the same way. Like, obviously, this was pretty universal. If you read Xenophon, it's pretty clear. The finest troops were deployed in the front. Right, so the toughest, also the best equipped, and so on. It's in a line of, 3, 4, even, it depends, right? Even deeper, naturally. But behind and or around these troops, there would be constantly these lighter armed men that were either the skirmishers, that also were pretty much universal in any army, and or the same people, sometimes, in fact, that would join the charge next to the tougher troops behind them to follow, what the wedge charge, for example, to make mass behind them, but just even for a psychological point of view, because, it's always been like that. And even literally disarmed people were placed behind the troops in many armies. You see it even in the Middle Ages, just to make mass and noise and confusion to unnerve the enemy. Also, famously enough, these Germans, this is famous especially during the migrations, but they traveled with the old people, hence the women were placed behind their men and encouraging them. And remember the thing we said before about that they wouldn't, that a family would never accept a warrior that had covered itself with shame, right? And actually, we know also in other contexts of this Germanic women bringing back home with on the shields the corpses of their men. It was an enormous pride to say, look, this died like a warrior, right? But naturally, I could talk also about the role of Germanic women in this whole thing, but just know that was there systematic or structural use of Germanic of female warriors in Germanic? No, there's never been. There would never be. And if there was one, it simply was an exception. Right, there is no proof of systematic involvement of women in Germany. We would make children, we would stay at home caring about the thing. There was no room for that. We find armed women just in those contexts that, where you see the migration, particularly militarized reality of frontier. But it's like saying, I don't know, that American women in the Wild West, shot with rifles from the caravans against the Native Americans. I mean, that's obvious. Like, we wouldn't. But that has literally nothing to do with the role of the woman. That was extremely rigidly, much more than many other societies, especially in the Germanic one, confined to the actually enormously important and complementary role of delivering and bringing up the next generation of warriors. Right? This is the thing. Like in the Spartan world, in the Roman world, women were very important, but still they had that specific role. There is no need to think that they had to fight as warriors to give importance to ancient women, because that's what they would have spit you in the face for, even just make you think about them. And the fact that in Germanic mythology there is reference to warrior women can be easily an indicator of the presence of some warrior woman, but it's also contextualized in a broader sacral sense that is very different from the practice of human life, right? Aside from the deities, I mean, and it has to be understood in ways that objectively we do not receive from any historical evidence, nor from a political, social, juridical, or military point of view about a systematic presence, a structural presence, or regular presence of women in Germanic warfare, like in any other people, by the way. And not even among the Sarmatians. That's just an Hellenic cliche for saying that there were women that knew how to go on horseback and use weapons. Well, thanks my eyes, those were nomadic peoples. That's basically all they did. So it's not strange to find women that could do that. The legend of the Amazons and so on. But that's an ethnographical cliche to say, look, those are the barbarians that are so upside down that even have women who fight, which is actually a declaration of the fact that it wasn't normal at all for ancient war standards. So this has exactly and perfectly nothing to do in any form with any discrimination against women in historical interpretation. It's pure history. And pure history tells you that that's a delusion, that we came up recently just for political reasons that have nothing to do with mental sanity. And it's not that a woman cannot fight. Hell, they can't fight like hell. And there have always been women who could fight and pretty damn well. But I'm just saying that there's no systematic and structural employment of female warriors in Germanic warfare, right? There is no doubt that women can punch and kick like crazy. I don't know if you have ever seen two women fighting. I mean, you think it's like something like, in fact, the stupid, masculistic cliche of that they're just women. That women smash. They use a terrible violence. I've rarely seen some of the most radically violent fights I've ever seen. A few actually, I think one or two, were by women. I never seen actually what took place in those scenarios, but what I've seen, men fighting. Right? It's a very different thing. It's vicious. It's vicious. As we know that, for example, a female bullying is pretty damn more vicious, especially from a psychological point of view, and much more devastating, much more dangerous than male one. But aside from that, this is a completely different thing. And I repeat it. Here we're not talking about a cultural list. Delusions. Here we're talking about structural evidence on solid understanding of warfare that we have ever since we studied war. There are specific political and social reasons why women had another role. Point. And there was no option at the time. You see, they want to help. Today, there is way more freedom and option wherever you want to live. At the time, there wasn't any. These people barely survived, so you couldn't do whatever you wanted, because your society would have crushed you, whether men or women, to do exactly and only what you were doing. That, in this case, was just for men slaughtering, for women child bearing, and okay, that's it. There was no concrete material temporal room of any sort for any other different role. No other. These people were just thinking about, will I be alive tomorrow? That's it. So there is also this cultural, an important aspect that we were saying before about the so-called barritos, as the Romans called it. That the ancient sources. So you see, when the Romans talk about these Germans, of course they say, I don't know if you ever studied German philology, how it's done, but we basically get these classical sources that tell pretty strange things sometimes. I mean, they obviously misunderstand the nature of those societies. I mean, these are still, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, a Roman narrative to make Romans understand what a biased and political instrumental idea of the Germans had to be. But incidentally, through this interpretation can be filtered many important information that in fact we study in German philology, for pointing out very concrete things that the Romans in that sense understood. Like, consider also these were senators. Of course they even went in these places and so on, but they were very detached compared to, I don't know, maybe a Roman legionary understood better what German culture at certain levels was, or some other NCO and so than they were senator did at certain levels, right? But if it wasn't for Roman sources, we wouldn't know anything about this all. So I've seen people making irony by saying, Tacitus, thank Tacitus for telling us that, for picturing the Germans as just primitive barbarians. Well, you should be thanking everything possible for even having a source of this kind. The fact that you, as a 21st century moron, does not understand a source, a context, a literature, a language written 2,000 years ago, without any perspective, is the truly disappointing thing. Because today our historiographies know pretty damn well what that context is, and it's you that you are ignorant, and this guy back in the day, had nothing to do with your incapacity of understanding him, right? So just open a freaking book in your life and stop saying, you know what. The barritos, this shout, this thing, was sometimes described by classical authors like something savage and truly barbaric, right? Very often was said, the Romans are always silent because they're disciplined. Actually, the Romans had this kind of thing. There's this myth that towards the late Roman times, the Romans got barbarized and therefore began to make the barritos themselves. What a terrible thing. The Romans had always done that, right? Especially since the beginning, as they were basically the same barbaric background. But secondly, because they, even in discipline, of course they charged shouting. That's an additional thing, right? Of course they weren't doing what the Romans meant in that sense is that they weren't doing this apparent very elaborate thing, because behind the war cry it wasn't just like a shout, right? Of course even the Romans would shout certain words, some certain phrases before attacking, that they were apotropaic, they were calling the gods, the vows, the martial vows and so on. But what we know about the Germans is that the Romans were in a much more modernized and secularized reality. The Germans were really, as it's widely known, chanting, singing certain formulas / stories / in fact songs proper that were about their ancestors, their dates, their gods, their so on. There are this beautiful picture. I don't know, I've always had it in my mind because I have this imaginative approach to visual approach to historical imagination after a battle. Just imagine a crude battle during Germanicus, retaliation in Germany, of a brute battle. Those ones you can't even say who won, who lost, right? Corpses everywhere in this German forest towards the evening while the mist is rising, and you imagine in this fields of the trees with this white looking corpses soaked in blood and so on, this songs, right? Just imagine being a Roman, a Roman legionary, your encampment from the other side, and hearing from the forest this song's going on. These were the prayers for the dead, for making the souls transitioning to the other side as true warriors, as Odin had promised them in the afterlife, this continuous glory, and if you want, this prize and this place and this mystic view of wherever the dead went, and singing more than that, because this was all. It was not individualistic. It was connected to the stock, to the clan, to the tribe. The idea that you had proven to be what your father had been, what your ancestors had been, that your family, that your work could be, your community could be proud of you, right? And think about the feelings that surely we know psychologically, but were felt in these primitive wars in a much more intense and semantically rich, we could say, way than in our days. Even if you look at languages like Germanic at this time was something incredibly primitive, extremely simple, extremely like a few sounds put together. Latin also was, as you know, a very concise language. Was fundamentally not much more developed than that one, but especially as far as we can think of the average speaker, not surely Cicero or Tacitus, but that had an Hellenic education, all this stuff. But that contained in these words and these spells literally a magic value, right? A meaning, something that went beyond. It told you about the mystery of the world, of the human existence, of your pride. And this is what these people fought and died like in their mindset. Have you ever thought what could be the last thought of a Germanic warrior while, stabbed by a gladius 10 times before taking down a warrior? It takes, like a human being in general. It's not like in movies that so you touch someone with the tip of his sword, it falls down. Like, you die after you can imagine in this battlefield for 2-3 days with your guts everywhere. What this was seen like, because you see that there is nothing romantic about this. Right, there is, if you think about this cultural side of the story, but you have to think at the most horrifying and unspeakable forms of violence you can ever imagine. I mean, after the Battle of Turburg Forest, the Germans decorated their sacred trees with Roman intestines. Do you know what it means? Do you mean what it being acquainted to this kind of violence? Just in the practice, I mean, just of literally disemboweling a human being. These people did it, and even much more regularly than you can imagine. Aside from the fact that they performed human sacrifices, like in that case, but also on a regular basis with others. But specifically, just think at what can be this mindset compared to our own. Like, can you explain that? I personally can't. I mean, more than telling you these things and flashing you with this emotional but considerations, but I can't make you understand it to you. I can't understand it. Nobody can understand it anymore. Maybe some warrior dispersed, I don't know, in some Indian Ocean island, those who have remained properly at the Stone Age, that still exist. Maybe can't understand this, but we can't. We can't anymore, because we went from there to here, which is a long way, right? That passed, however, through this, and you never have to forget about the blood that has been shed, the sufferings, the enslavement, the extermination, the abuse of millions of people from everybody, from these great empires, from these small tribes. That's what they have lived for millennia, and we live now the way we do. Never forget about this. Never give for granted what you have every day, because it's not to be given for granted. It's not even, I mean, you can't even say it can't happen again, because it happened also pretty damn recently. It keeps happening, and it's same dirty, disgusting. That's why a stinky thing. Can you imagine what a battlefield smelled like after Ida Stavisis, right? the rotten corpse. Have you idea how disgusting an experience like this is, right? And here we're talking about a violence, an unspeakable violence. The I don't know. I don't have the words. I don't think I have to insist too much on it. But I don't want to be too graphic. But I really want to make you understand the mental distance. Because once again, this is not about what kind of weapons they used, right? It's not because they used a Frame or a Gladius that made the difference. The difference was holding their heads compared to us. That's the only thing you have to care about. All the rest comes second. It's horrifying, but beautiful, utterly beautiful and horrifying. Like most things in life, unfortunately. The Barbarians, how was it performed? Well, famously, it was like a murmur. It began like a murmur at least, and it increased and rose like a thunderstorm, right? From a low voice, and then it rose to the highest pitched yell, right? It was something frightening. Just think about being, once again, a Roman legionnaire, with showing this in front of you. And that's something devastating, and that's where the Romans really had their own cold blood, right? Because they didn't do that, but of course at the last moment, they were last meters when they charged, eventually they would shout their own thing, and that was really bad news from the guys from the other side. But just imagine what it means to be a Germanic warrior and being part of this all, of having your, like, it didn't happen every day to fight, especially against in these big battles. It was in many ways what all these warriors wished to die, like, right? Not killed, in a ditch by an arrow, something, but really dying, slain in open field. These massive battles between tribes, that the greatest pride, the greatest deeds, these people were insanely, unhealthily obsessed with their own individual glory and honor. That's all they had. That's all they wished for. That's what they hoped their descendants, their children and grandchildren would think of, because these things entered in the legend of it, right? And the interesting thing is that, in fact, from German epics and the sagas, that part of this stuff is being passed down to us, right? Very, mediated through the eras, the mentalities and so on. But it remained, in a way, and listening this power mounting. It was Woden. It was Woden mounting together with the army, right? These people, if I don't know, a thundering roar right from the clouds from their back, these people were they lost it. They knew that the victory was their side. The gods were their side. They would be able to accomplish incredible things. Right here, it's funny when in reenactment they try to explain to you what this guy's fought like by having just modern guys with modest physicality and mindset poking at each other with sticks and so on, and trying to explain the deep mechanics just with 10 people from both sides, by the way, because large formations do not exist historically and they're not important, right? But of course I understand the material limits, but they try to explain you because how it really was, right? If you do not have this mindset, how the hell do you think you can explain even a minimal movement that these people did? What do you think? It's mechanical? We do not know anything about that. You do not know you cannot know anything about a person that could literally run into a spear and being transpassed, being butchered down by still smashing down with a club, skulls and Roman helmets with the pieces of brain, spurting everywhere. You cannot understand it. You cannot understand. You will never understand it. It's useless. What we can know about these realities is all in the realization that we cannot understand. that gives us some realistic dimension of what it could be like. What you poke left and right, centimeter more, centimeter less, has zero value from any historical point of view. Any. Nobody cares. Right? Study history, look at sources, study languages. That's what you have to do in order to understand something about this world. The rest is not a real thing. Right? This is not, because I don't appreciate what reenactors do, but do not pretend that is a kind of a scientific evidence. I mean, experimental archaeology is one thing, but as long as you want to measure a march, times of that kind, but when it gets to combat, that's a completely different thing. You cannot understand it. You will not make it. You will not be able to reconstruct not even a 2% of what it practically was. Weapons are literally the least important thing of all. I'm sorry. What counts is how much you want to reap off the guts of the person you have in front. Weapons are literally the least important of this whole thing, of the whole experience of combat. And I'm not exaggerating. The Germans also held the shield over the mouth to produce an echo effect, right? So of course some German shield were also concave, they were not all flat, but mostly were designed to create this so-called shield wall that, contrarily-wise to, I don't know why, presumably just war gamers believe that that's an offensive thing. It's not, right? You can use the shield in an offensive way, but you cannot fight without an offensive thing. The shield wall serves primarily to stop missile fire. Then you have to freaking fight. It's not that you win things because of the shield wall. Everybody, the shield wall. Every single damn freaking stinky infantry in the world has ever been able to make a shield wall. It's nothing special. Zero special. The thing that really makes the difference is how much you are trained or determined to maintain that freaking formation, and how much you freaking skill with the spear you have in your hand. Right? And this thing was insanely intense. Then I would spend, as we were saying before, some word for the Batavi that where a German, you see, even in the pictures I've inserted certain auxiliaries, and I presume most of the viewers will say, oh, these are Romans, I have this video on the Germans. Those are Germans. Those are Germans, right? Yeah, they are Germans dressed up like Roman soldiers, because guess what? The word Germans were proud, not just proud Roman soldiers, but proud Roman citizens and Romans, right? Such as the Batavi. That also created problems to the Romans at some point. In fact, that's the point. That they provided, as you know, the Batavians are today fundamentally the Netherlands. And they were inside, say this way, the Roman Empire. Say they were from the left side of the limes, Germania inferior, right? And they were excellent auxiliaries. As we were saying before, these guys provide mostly, as you know, the auxiliaries, especially in these first centuries of the empire, provided usually those tactical specialties they were best at. These were mostly infantrymen. And we talked about the Battle of Mons Grau because we made a video about it. But in 69 AD, they also took advantage of a series of Roman civil wars. It was the famous, the year which there were several, upheavals in Rome, various emperors succeeding on the throne. So the Batavians eventually were faithful. All these peoples had pretty clear that they could earn something from the Romans. These guys were an example, but still they were also eager to seize other opportunities as they present. So basically the Batavi, led by an officer of auxiliaries named Civilis, there was this giant extrovert with only one eye who distinguished himself from the Romans by proceeding to grow his hair long and dye it bright red. Right. He brought over at least one ala, that is a cavalry unit, and 4 cohortes who fought against their former masters as regular units under Roman standards, alongside a larger number of wild Germans fighting under tribal wild beast standards. of course, the limits was very permeable. There was not, as we were saying before, like an inside and an outside of the Roman Empire properly manned. And surely these areas, even inside the empire, the two Germanies were pretty. There wasn't a dramatic romanization over time of these places. I mean, there was, but less than in other provinces. And Civilis fought a long and clever campaign with a number of successful engagements, especially among these native marshes. Then eventually the Batavians were put down, were subjected, and imposed actually very humiliating terms by the Romans that was maybe not very clever at the end of the day. But that reveals the opportunity still of the idea of being, 1 foot inside the empire and still being out in a way, and seizing the opportunity. Consider that in all this there were movements naturally of troops that would become more intense by the 3rd century. We explained that with the video on the Simmacari, of literally foreigners that went to fight for Rome in the empire, then came back out of the empire. Like we have it, especially for late Roman times, but even in this time actually wasn't so strange. So as we were saying before, and a bit as a conclusion, the Germans, aside from Arausio, that also was a pretty miserable performance of Roman chain of command, didn't win any major pitched battle in open field, right? Nor they called for any special tactical ploys, right? Which speaks actually for especially if you truly believe in Clausewitzian theory, and you have a real strategical culture, is the most concrete proof of what really the Germans were about in terms of development, right? You cannot judge these people because it's either sympathetic or antipathetic to you. Especially on Schwerpunkt, we don't care because we like the Germans, we like the Romans, and we say what it is, and we don't care about the rest. But this is an objective reality. Some people do not accept it because for identity reasons they have to stress that their ancestors, whichever they are, it can be the Germans, it can be the Romans, were the special ones, and therefore they cannot accept that there was a mediocre average out there in the world. The Germans distinguished themselves in many ways, but also were similar to other peoples, right? That also sometimes we don't give much about, simply because the modern countries these realities existed in are way or more or less important than others, made it echoing more or less than others, right? If Romania had been the hegemonic power in Europe at some point in history, now we would be obsessed by the Dacians. And if Germany hadn't been modern Germany, nobody would give a damn about the Germans. This is unfortunately the thing that affects historiography, and that is even interesting actually to study, because you realize also what is that you truly think and where you heard it from, and how it is not actually your own idea, but you're just being fed by someone else that you do not confirm. So we try here to be very balanced and very, very objective, very impartial, very neutral, and this is my take on it. Like, I've been studying these things for years. It's not that I'm not even an expert objectively, because as you know, I'm a medievalist, but as we were saying before, these are not topics that you need a dramatic expertise to know how exhaustible they are. Right? There are certain topics in history nobody has still properly studied. These are things that, I repeated, are studied ever since they have been written down. That is 2,000 of years. So once again, you cannot come up and pretend that you have it better, than the others. I myself follow. I say it now that this is my opinion, but I actually follow what it's the. There is no such thing like a mainstream historiography, like any mainstream whatsoever. But I mean, what's the historiographical, academic, scientific standards about these issues? That is, nobody questions fundamentally these concepts. There are certain details maybe about how they fought, how they millimetrically shifted a spear from one side or the other. These are the debatable things. well, we wish we knew more actually in substantial about that kind of combat level, but I mean, relatively to the historiographical interpretation, that's it. I mean, you can read all the all the historiography about this stuff in one day. I mean, at the sources of the time. Then, of course, to study the historiography about these things, it doesn't take a lifetime, I presume. But literally, that's it. The best you can do is to increase your knowledge about lots of other things around it, to define it better, to frame it better. And that's unfortunately what most people do not have, and that's what they do not understand. Many people presume that this is like a free-for-all, opinion-based judgment, and that's a declaration of not having ever read the sources, not knowing anything about the fundamentals, the ABC of what you should know about this stuff. So, I mean, if you don't like how history went, it's not my fault. It's not, nor history's fault, in a way. That's it. And there is nothing bad to say that. I mean, you know that on Schwerpunkt we make mostly, I would say, a Latin Germanic history to tell it all, because mostly because of medievalistic perspectives, and also, of course, whatever the... I'm personally very involved. I like very much the relation between the two cultures, so it's maybe my specific aim, but that's exactly the dichotomy. I mean, the comparative side of the story that is important, right? It's important to distinguish single realities, not by basically burning every other reality around because you presume that all it matters is that people because you like it particularly. If you do so, basically you kill your own people, because you basically throw away the capacity of dimension it in the historical spectrum. So people will fixate on a single people and they think they may have to make all their lives about them. They're actually insulting their own people, because without other peoples that wouldn't even have a meaning. Right? So comparative perspectives are the only ones that work. And this must be accepted. That's why we talk now about all the ancient world peoples here, and we will hopefully go on with this. We will talk about other things over time. We'll talk about the battle to Toto Bergerwald. We'll talk about Germanicus campaigns. We've already said essentially what we will do, and continue in the late Roman period and even beyond. As you know, we made many videos deal with all the eras, right? That's it. We could address the fact, I don't know, but just one thing I think we skipped is, the Roman capacity, for example, of concentrating firepower, the fact that the Romans had things, a military engineering capabilities of, think about torsion catapults, or specialized troops coming from the well-known world, missile troops. So the Germans, in this sense, were a bit at a disadvantage, because they basically had to either stay there and take it up to the melee, or to go away. So there are good examples of this, especially in Germanicus campaigns, that are remarkable. But these examples also show how difficult it was to soften up the German ranks before charging into them. I mean, Germanicus famously at some point had to use the Praetorian Guard. There was with missile troops you don't win wars in these times, right? They just facilitate the work, but still the thing is resolved in the melee. So, yeah, this is just another idea I was missing. For now, I think we can stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.